This hearing 11, sites and areas of significance to Māori. Just before we start the hearing, just to remind everyone about the COVID restrictions, is basically to separate as much as you can and to wear a mask when you're not speaking, the basic rules to observe. And in terms of health and safety, I understand, Ash, that it's just a matter of if there is an emergency to go through these doors here and to assemble out in the car park. Would that be right? Yes, okay. I think some of the people here have been to some hearings already, so you'll be well familiar with the protocols. All right, now before we go any further, I'll just ask Commissioner Yvette to, Councillor Lewis, to open the hearing with a karakia, please. Kia ora, Yvette. Thank you. All right, we'll just start with some introductions first of all. On the panel today, we have Commissioner Hassan, Commissioner Couch-Lewis, Commissioner Willis, and my name's Gary Ray. I'm chairing the panel today. We also have Justine Ashley here, who's the Senior Planner advising the panel. And we have the reporting officer, Craig Friedel, who's here as well. I believe we have Mr. Davis, Kyle Davis, zooming in, who's with MKT, who provided a technical report to assist the 42A report. So that's all of us, and we have a number of parties in the gallery today, and we'll come to you in due course. But we have the first submitter, Federated Farmers of New Zealand, North Canterbury, Dr. Lionel Hume and Carolyn Amies. So would you like to come forward, please, when you're ready? Thank you very much for attending. We have read your statement, Dr. Hume, and thank you very much for preparing that. I found it very informative and well written. So we're in your hands as to how you wish to present that. We will have some questions, but present it how you wish. Okay, thank you very much. And you can take your mask off when you speak, and just touch the little button on the microphone. Yeah.
No, we're not planning to say anything particularly other than possibly make a general statement that we're certainly on board with the notion of sites of significant for Māori. We simply want the requirements to be reasonable and practical, and also not to have adverse consequences. And with that in mind, perhaps the requirements around earthworks could be a problem, where someone's wanting to upgrade an irrigation system to use water more efficiently, reduce nutrient discharge. Yeah, they're going to need to bury some pipes in the ground, for example. So it's just one practical example that occurred, but I'm very open to questions.
Open to questions? Okay, well let's do that. And just when you've finished speaking, just touch the button and the microphone will come off. That's good. And it might be useful to have it closer to you as well when you're responding. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for that. We've, as I say, we've got your statement, and there'll be a number of questions. So we'll just start with Commissioner Hassan at the end, if you have any questions.
Tēnā kuru. Kia ora and thank you for your submissions. I certainly found it very informative, and supportive too in a lot of areas, and for that I thank you. And there is a lot there for in terms of consideration, which I'll definitely be looking at in terms of the deliberation. So I actually have no questions of clarification. I found it very good and points that I could take forward. So again, thank you very much for your submission. It's appreciated. Kia ora.
Andrew.
Yes, thanks for your evidence. I've got a couple of questions. So paragraph 13, you talk a little bit about needing a mechanism for allowing minor earthworks in the sites near significance to Māori. And you also talk a little bit about earthworks in paragraph 16 as well, around some of the changes that have been made. It's just a question for you. So the changes that are proposed by the officer in their appendix 2 for the Tiranga Tupener overlay, do those changes satisfy you in relation to that overlay? Because it does include things such as installation of farm infrastructure pipelines, and it does include things such as the burial of a deceased animal. Is that sufficient for you in terms of that overlay, or are you still seeking more, or are you wanting some of those rules to go across into those other overlays as well? Can you just clarify that, please?
Yeah, those touch upon two of the things that occurred to us, burying cables and pipes and the dead animal. It would be useful if they went into the other overlays as well. And I guess it's very difficult to generalise because I feel I don't have my head around enough of where the more precious sites occur and to what extent they are and how they will affect individual properties in terms of whether they cover most of the property or half of it or not much at all. That sort of context will affect what's needed, I guess.
Sure. But I guess the thrust of your submission really is about you're recognising the importance of these areas, but at the same time you're also seeking to have a framework and a set of provisions that enable ongoing practices that have occurred without undue constraint and requirements for resource consent and consultation, basically, is essentially what you're saying. Okay. So just looking through another question here. You said Federate, so paragraph 21, mineral extraction. You said Federate Farmers continues to believe that farm quarry should be operated as a permitted activity, particularly those that already exist. And I was just looking for the rationale why. I mean, it might be bleedingly obvious, but I just didn't see it there. Is it because existing activity and they need to continue to use those farm quarries?
Yeah, that was mostly what I had in mind. And as far as extending farm quarries goes, well, I don't know, I've got limited experience with farm quarries, but the ones that I know about are sort of in a continual process of extension. Every time you want some more gravel, well, the thing gets extended a bit.
Yeah, well, that was one of my questions as well, because isn't it? It's always extended. That's the point of how a quarry works, isn't
it? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, if you want, how much of an extension is defined as extending the quarry, and what sort of use is regarded as existing use? I guess is a question that could come up.
Yeah, sure. And so my sort of final question is in relation to subdivision rule 20. And I think you proposed some changes around. I think what you're trying to achieve is to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have, say, a 40 hectare, 100 hectare site, and the site and area of significance is on part of that site, and you're subdividing the rest of the site that's nowhere near the site of significance, are you saying why does that need consent and consultation requirements when you're not touching the area that's actually has a site and area of significance on it, on that site? Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes,
so it's only if you're subdividing through the area that has a site, an area of significance on the site, then that rule should apply. But you're trying to come up with a mechanism, so the site's here, but actually you can subdivide this whole half off without affecting that. That's what you're trying to achieve with your changes?
That's exactly right.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and I think the wording you chose, the officer wasn't keen on some of that wording because it is introduced elements of, well, change some of the definitions, I guess, and introduce some new terms, I think, is from memory. And that's one of the reasons why they weren't keen on it. But I guess I was wondering if it was simply the subdivision of an area comprising a site of significance to Māori. So you had to be subdividing the area that comprises that site of significance to Māori, rather than subdividing the site, which has a definition, which is the whole site, the parcel boundary, and that might narrow it down. And I guess would you be supportive if there was a way to achieve that outcome, but not necessarily using the same words you proposed?
Yes, I think so.
All right. No, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Just thank you. Just for a follow up on a couple of those questions. The quarries one. I understand the point you made in your evidence that taking any more material from a quarry is by default extending that quarry, and therefore it triggers another rule, and it would essentially render the use of the quarry unworkable in terms of the rules. So I think that's the point you're making. I'm not sure if that's the case, but we might ask for a response in due course. But if the panel was to accept your argument about that, the options to us would seem to be to have some sort of schedule of existing quarries that are recognised in some way, or to have a rule that provides for some additional take from a quarry within 10% or something of that nature. I've dealt with some of these things in the Dunedin plan. The quarries were all scheduled, but I think with farm quarries, they're probably very low key things, and they're not necessarily recorded very well. Would that be fair? Do you know from your experience that are they just informal sort of quarries that are not recorded in any way?
Yeah, from my very limited experience, that's probably fair comment.
That seems to be a bit of a dilemma, but we'll come back to that. All right. I think probably the final question I had was in relation to your paragraph 24. Now, the MKT report that we've had in front of us and we've looked at does give advice on protocols and procedures and agreements and ways of doing things, if you like. But as I understand it, other than some amended policies which are being suggested to us, a lot of that detail is not included in the district plan or in the chapter. Have you got any sort of suggestions about that? Are you happy to have are you happy with a sort of side agreements or an understanding that's written outside of the plan, supported by policies? Any further thoughts on that?
Provided it's accessible to people, I guess my concern was that there seemed to be lack of information about what was required and what the process would be for people to be compliant.
And you have, thank you for that. And you have got a table of recommended changes to the provisions at the end of your evidence. Quite a lot of detail there. I'm just going to look through to see if you suggested anything about that. Did you have any particular
Was this in our submission?
Yes, and the written statement. For instance, in paragraph 23, you've said Federated Farmers requested that specific wording be introduced to specify what matters are to be addressed in each particular location. And they were the same for MAT 1, MAT 2, and MAT 3, the assessment matters. So I presume they're in there. But when I go to your table, it says make any necessary consequential amendments, amend to contain specific wording as to what matters are to be addressed in each overlay. So I guess my question is, did you provide any words, or were you just asking for that to be done?
Not that I'm aware of. I didn't write our submission, so all I've got is what's in front of me also.
That's all the questions we have. Did your colleague have anything you wish to say or to add to?
So this is my first one that I've been to, so I've really come as a learning experience. So I'm Caroline, I'm the North Canterbury Provincial President. Yeah, so that's really why I'm here, so that next time I know what to do and
Possibly.
possibly.
Yeah, no, look, we do thank you for your attendance. It's a very concise and clear statement, and we have asked some questions, but I think that's we understand what you're saying now. So thank you for that. We'll take that into due consideration. Thank you very much. All right, we'll just ask the next submitter to come forward, please. Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture Incorporated. Thank you. Right. We've had some material handed out to us today, so maybe if you can introduce yourself, please, and take us through that. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'll provide a short spoken introduction and I'm available to answer any questions you might have. I'm Kerry Barnett, the Environmental Advisor for Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture Incorporated, and I'm also part of a family farming partnership which owns land that's proposed to have a Ngāwai site located on it. And I've listed that site there at Harts Creek. ESI specifically represents 111 landowners, predominantly family farmers, and many of whom are affected by the proposed Sesam Wāhi Tapu and Taonga, Ngā Turanga Tupener and Ngāwai provisions. And the reason why we specifically state that is possibly our members are the most affected by the provisions. ESAI has provided a pre-circulated written statement, and since lodging that statement, myself and Ms. Jane West, a submitter who's sitting behind me, have constructed a joint list of requested relief. And I understand you've got an electronic version.
Yes, we have only just seen that, so we appreciate taking us through that.
Yeah. Essentially, what's in that is already in both of our evidence, but we thought there may be value in putting the two together. We seek several amendments to the rules, the matters of control and discretion in the planning maps for Sesam. In particular, and of utmost importance, it seeks the removal of the Ngā Turanga Tupuna overlay and the replacement of this overlay with amendments to other rules as alternative methods of still providing for Sesam in this area where necessary. The group considers that that overlay is unnecessary because it replicates the same area provided in the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan as the Cultural Landscape Values Management Area, and consequently duplicating regulation of certain land uses. It is not consistent with the treatment of the complementary and adjacent provisions of the Christchurch District Plan that applies a Ngāwai overlay in the Lake Ellesmere Tiwa Hora area, covering the lake bed and riparian margins and wetlands, but not stretching noticeably further landward. The activities which the overlay area aims to restrict, i.e. earthworks, mining, plantation, forestry and subdivision, are already regulated sufficiently within the proposed plan, regional plan, the NES for plantation forestry and the Heritage New Zealand Pohari Taonga Act 2014, many of which allow considerably for iwi input either through iwi being involved in devising these provisions or having specific cultural values and impacts considered during resource consent processes. Other provisions within the proposed plan will sufficiently provide for Sesam values to be taken into account and consultation with Papatipu Runanga. Earthworks are already highly regulated within this area without the need for further regulation. Forestry and mineral extraction are not activities which pose a high risk of development in the area. This is largely due to property sizes and physical character limitations. And in addition to the information already submitted in our statement regarding the lack of forestry and mining activities observed in this area, I've also recently received from the Selwyn District Council a list of mining and forestry consent applications that have been applied for since the early 1990s, and that's attached as Annex 1. And so from that, you can see that no forestry or mining activities have been applied for in this area. And generally, they would, even with permitted activity status sometimes, they would definitely trigger a consent requirement. Suggested changes to other provisions within the proposed plan can be applied to allow for cultural considerations in lieu of the need to apply this overlay. As an alternative relief option, and Ms. West and I have given considerable thought to devising an alternative Ngā Turanga Tupener overlay area that might be suitable to both Papatipu Runanga and submitters. However, the potential boundaries for this replicated the boundaries of the outstanding natural landscape area associated with the lake, the coastal environment overlay, and the Wahitanga, Wahitapu, and Ngāwai Satam overlays. Within these overlays, there are numerous opportunities for cultural values and impacts evaluation and Papatipu Runanga input. It is on this basis that ESI believes that that overlay is unnecessary as an additional mechanism to maintain protection of sites and areas of significance to Māori. Consistency with the SASM objective and policies and fulfilling the requirements of the RMA can also be successfully maintained without the overlay. These plan provisions and their subsequent implementation are highly important to not only iwi, but also those landholders affected. ESAI genuinely intends, through the relief it seeks, to provide practical, positive, constructive, and protective outcomes for SASM while still allowing for land use activities to be environmentally sustainable, flexible to market demands, and efficient. Ngā mihi, and thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
All right, thank you for that. I'll hand it over to the panel shortly, Ms. Barnett, but just a couple of procedural things, I guess. You've provided a very thorough statement of evidence to us, and we do appreciate that. It's clear you've put a lot of thought, and your group have put a lot of thought into this, and that's acknowledged. But what I was going to, I understand you're a planner, is that right? You're a qualified planner?
Yes, so
Yeah.
I'm not currently a member of the Planning Institute because I left my consultancy I worked for to have a family, and farming now requires a massive input from all family members, so it's not really doable.
That's okay. I just wonder, do you have qualifications in planning?
Yes, I've got a master's in geography and then secondary additional certificates in proficiency from the regional planning course at Lincoln University.
And you've operated as a planner for the council and something?
Yes, so I was the team leader for consents there for 2 years, but prior to that I also worked on the what was way back then the proposed district plan as well.
Right. No, the reason I ask you that is that your statement is very detailed and it covers planning in a big way, to be honest, and you've written it as a sort of a statement from your organisation.
Yes.
It doesn't say I or my opinion, but
No.
it clearly goes into planning. And I think if you'd like us to consider that as expert evidence, we need to record your qualifications and so forth, and you've done that. So would you like it to be considered as expert evidence? Because you've certainly filed it in time and you've followed all the protocols.
So our reasoning is that while I don't operate essentially as an expert at the moment, I do use my background to help inform the group that I do the work for. So it's more of an advocacy role.
It's more of an advocacy role. Okay, no, that's fine. That's understood. Now, there'll be a number of questions, but I'll throw it over to the panel now. But the first, because you've provided a summary statement and you've focused on the key things, and you've also got a joint statement which we'll have a look at in a minute. But just in terms of the Ngā Turanga Tupener overlay, you're essentially asking for it to be removed because it's unnecessary. Because as I understand it, you don't oppose the need to meet those objectives and policies and rules, but you see a duplication with other provisions, and you've given all the reasons and bullet points there. But just as a general observation, as a planner, do you feel there is duplication where you've got the ECAN role, the regional council roles, and the district council roles? Do you really think that all the district council functions are covered by those other provisions? And it's just a question. I'm not challenging on it. I'm just asking.
No,
You don't
this
think there's
is
any gap?
I think there is provision there where there's a lot of muddy water between the two, basically. We think the majority of things are caught by the regional plan, and where they're not caught specifically by regional rules for agricultural activities, they're certainly then caught by the implementation of farm environment plans and what needs to be done as part of those. But in saying that, our reasoning for then looking at offering up an alternative to the overlay is proposing some changes to those other provisions that would then result in having to address the further cultural issues outside of that overlay.
On that, those other provisions you're seeking changes to, are they within the scope of this panel to deal with? Are they regional council things, or are they other parts of the district plan?
No, they would be other parts in the district plan. For instance,
Right.
we've offered some further assessment matters and matters of control that might be inserted within general rules, say in the rural zone, that could be applied if you're doing earthworks activities. And then we came to the view that for mining and forestry activities, you could also have some provisions within, their discretionary activities, or in some cases non-complying activities, and some of the other overlays, that there's a lot of scope there to then take into account cultural matters or sites.
Right. So just on that, so you've asked for relief with other chapters of the plan, potentially that we may not be aware of, or is it all encapsulated in your evidence?
We've made rather a sweeping submission to this chapter. So we believe that does offer the scope, and that in the very first submission on the list that has challenged the entire chapter as a form to allow some flexibility.
It does provide a lot of scope.
Yeah.
I won't ask many further questions at this stage, but I might come back later. Right, we'll just hand over to the other members. Deborah, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do have. Just for a clarification, with regards to farm environmental management plans, are they covered by every separate site within the overlay?
So how that works is that around the lake area, there's the cultural landscapes values management area. So if you have land within that area, which essentially replicates the Tupener overlay in the district plan. So if you're farming within there, you must have a farm environment plan, and you must have a resource consent to farm. So all your activities in terms of what you're doing there, which also includes not just nutrient management, but also offal pits and those often day-to-day things where I can't really think of anything these days other than offal pits really that require excavation. Farm quarries is kind of a dying art really on farms in that area, just because of topography and hitting groundwater basically. So they're not that prevalent at all. So if you're getting audited for your farm environment plan, there's a whole host of things you must display and show the auditor, and more often than not, they will pick up on those. Anything that looks remotely like an excavation or whatever will get overseen. That's our experience, and having been audited 2 times at our place, is that they're the things that the auditor always comes to look at.
So for properties under 10 hectares, are they actually audited the same way as properties over 10 hectares?
Just from memory and without having the regional plan in front of me, I'm very sure that if you were within that zone, you would need to have a farm environment plan, and whether that is required to have a resource consent attached to it. I couldn't actually answer that without having a look at the rules at the moment. But there is provision there that if you're within that area, you're more than likely to have a farm environment plan and a resource consent. Sorry, if I could just add, that also relates to river zones as well. So that cultural overlay in the regional plan is not just the area around the lake, it's 20 metres either side of a waterway as well. So that grabs a whole bigger area than just immediately around the lake.
Tēnā koe. Kia ora and thank you for your submissions. I have read your submissions with interest and looked across the different provisions that you have there. And I guess that for me, just for a point, I've got 2 points of clarification that I'd like. The first one is the overlay you are looking to have removed is the overlay that is within the Waikora zone area.
Yes,
What I'm asking is that under, oh sorry, as I'm reading these submissions, I keep calling the SM, I keep calling it SAM as I'm going through, and I went to say that, so I apologise for the significant areas and sites for Māori. The overlay, I just want to make sure that when we talk about any deletion, the area that we're actually referring to.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure of that. So for clarification, can you just clarify for me the area of deletion you are asking for? And it's the overlay that you're asking
so
for.
it is the entire overlay. And as I said previously, we did put our mind to the potential of, perhaps looking at, is there some areas that we think should perhaps still stay in out of that overlay? And the only thing really that came to mind was some an area where around the marae that's just stretched between that and Muriwai, which is Cooper's Lagoon. So, but it's tricky for us to make that call without having talked with MKT about, what is of particular importance around there. So we've sort of steered away from that because we think that our other suggestions and other provisions, we hope, will still satisfy and meet the requirements of the 3 activities of earthworks, mining and forestry would still work without the need for that overlay.
Sure. So then, in your discussions that you had amongst with your community, when you were looking at that Ngāti Ranga Tupener overlay, what were your considerations? How were you defining that and making the distinction between, say, a wāhi tapu? So, because some of the recommendations that you're making, like in terms of the schedules and everything, you are referring to the changes that would take it into a wāhi tapu area.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just have an understanding in your own words in terms of your understanding and your community's understanding of what that overlay looks like in terms of those restrictions.
That's a very good question. Thank you. And I would say that in all honesty, our view is somewhat a little uneducated just because we haven't been able to have these really strong discussions with the likes of MKT, and we're advocating through an engagement policy to be able to move forward that way. But in our view, we found it a little bit confusing sometimes in reading in the district plan, in the proposed plan provisions, that there was quite a bit of overlay between, to use that term, between the 4 different SESM sites to determine exactly what we thought each one was about. And we appreciate that it may not be that easy to determine, but for us, we understand things like Wāhi Tapu sites and the Taonga sites have special elevated meaning, and that often that revolves around silent file areas and sites that are very special and sacred to Māori. And then Ngāwai, we understand, has more of a relationship to Mahinga Kai and being able to access traditional food gathering sites. And that's where we thought, well, for the other overlay, that it was more broad spread, and we were very uncertain actually, well, what is the difference between this site and those other 3 sites, which we could rationalise in our heads about how they came about. They were covered in the previous district plan. Their boundaries were very similar to what was in that, and we could rationalise that in our heads, but we had difficulty coming to terms with, well, if the Turanga Tupener overlay was used, we sort of found that as maybe just being encapsulating several of those other things, but that it was essentially important around lake management and activities nearby the lake and ancestral activities. So that's where we thought, well, it probably would have been better perhaps to have known exactly where particular sites within that area were, so we had a little bit more guidance as to where they were. And from our investigation, we came to the point that they seemed to be under the the existing district plan, more around the Marae area, one particular area up towards Harts Creek, which is also already listed as a Wāhi Tapu or Taonga site, the special islands within the lake, but then seemed to diminish as you headed more towards Banks Peninsula. So that's where we sort of rationalised things in our head, and it wasn't that we think, well, that doesn't matter, we can disregard that, and it wasn't those thoughts at all. It was more how can we still recognise within the provisions of the plan without the need for an overlay that very much replicates the existing one under the regional plan.
Apologies. I'm hearing 2 layers there. And just wanting some clarification on that. So one of the concerns that you may have is that there are not sites that have been identified within that Ngāranga Tupener overlay. There are no sites within there. But the overlay that would come over from a Wāhi Tapu, Wāhi Taonga within there, then will be stating those actual sites, and you want to know where those actual sites are. So you're seeing 2 layers over your land and the conflict that those 2 might actually bring. So by deleting one, it will take away the others? No?
No, probably not, because the Wāhi Tapu and Wāhi Taonga overlays are single in themselves, so they don't have the other one coming over the top. But the Ngāwai areas are different. So around the lake, you've got the Ngāwai overlay over very much the margins and the lake bed, but then the Turanga Tupener one comes over top of that as well, but then spreads out further landward. Yeah. I guess the crux of our submission really is to avoid the duplication of what is in the regional plan, and to look at how, if any of those gaps that fall out of what's not covered in the regional plan that can be covered in the district plan is done so, but doesn't require that overlay. That's all right.
For me, it's really important to be quite clear in terms of the intent.
Yes.
That when you were looking across those duplications, that what it was that you were trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So when you look at the overlay, the intent of that overlay, what it is to achieve.
Yeah.
And also the sites of significance in terms of Wāhi Tapu, Wāhi Tonga.
Yeah.
So those are really important. The intent, the purpose of what they want to be able to achieve. That was the reason I asked the question, with the purpose. Is there anything you want to add in terms of the purpose? What did the community see was the purpose behind the overlay for mana whenua, for tangata whenua, over that area?
Yeah. In all honesty, I think they had difficulty trying to determine what the purpose was when they looked at that with the other three overlays, because it kind of did marry in a few of the things that was also appearing in those other overlays. So there was that going on, and because we hadn't been able to talk with MKT previously, that provides that uncertainty, I guess. So that's where we're saying we don't want to ignore the value of that particular overlay, but we think by looking very strongly in the detail in the regional plan and what other provisions like accidental discovery protocol and all those things, that we think they cover them really well, and that for the gaps that aren't met by them, we think we can cover those in other provisions without the need for the overlay.
And in terms of looking, I know within your submission that in the office report that there was not felt that there was not. In terms of the section 42 report, looking at that, there is no scope in terms of looking at whether there is a policy that might be put within the plan. In your submission, you are submitting that you have provided enough evidence across to be able to give us scope, to be able to reconsider that. In terms of the wording that was in the MKT report, if there should be scope that is seen, that wording that was suggested there, and it would be in line with other district plans. Do you have a view on that at all, that wording?
Oh, and so you're referring to the potential engagement policy? Yes. Yes, we thought it was a good start, but we certainly saw that there may actually be a need for that to be not outside the plan. It needed to be in the plan. I know other councils may have it a combination of two things happening, that there's a policy but also procedural matters that sit outside the plan. So our view is that actually if there are procedural matters, to make it clear that they should actually be in the plan with the engagement policy. So it's absolutely clear. And where there might be a situation, there's a need to diverge from those, that diversion is also listed as to what situations that might occur as well. So whilst we think, yes, there is probably scope, and we see that as a major step forward to have such a policy in the district plan, that it would be good to have some ability to look at the wording of that, and whether that's through a workshop as an interim decision of this hearing panel or whatever, then certainly our group would be open to considering taking part in that.
Kia ora and thank you.
Thank you for that. That was one of the matters the panel asked the officer. We had some, I should have mentioned that as with all hearings, we have some pre-questions that we put to the officer, and they've been posted on the website with responses. And that was one of the matters that we've asked further advice on, as to how those protocols sit outside the plan and how they're enforced. And I think the answer we got was that the amended policies sort of they address that aspect, and they don't refer to the protocols, but they provide more detail on how it's going to operate. Your submission is that doesn't go far enough, and that's what we've heard. Is that right?
Yes. We would definitely like, because our experience has been difficult, and you've seen in the evidence that we have good outcomes, but then we have some very tricky and maybe not so appropriate outcomes in our view. So we would like the engagement policy and the protocols to fully understand what this actually means on the ground when it's put in place. So that is why we are requesting that there is some ability for the wider community to have some input into that.
Thank you. I'll just.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your statements. It's you've covered a lot of ground in it, so thank you for that. I do have a few questions. And I'll do it in relation to the order of your statement. So paragraph 4.12, and you've looked at some sites are located in significantly built up areas, e.g. Rakai hut settlements or small rural sites where cultural values have already been significantly compromised.
Mm-hmm.
So apart from the Rakai huts, these sites near of significance to Māori appear to be generally over rural zone land. Is that your understanding? Apart from Rakai huts?
Yes, there is. So okay. That's Wāhi Tapu and Wāhi Taonga sites that are covered. Yeah.
And so in your paragraph, you talk about small rural sites. So what is a small rural site?
Okay, so this is one example, is the Hants Honey site, which is near what's on the banks of Harts Creek, and it's near where the Harts Creek walkway begins. And it's a small site there that has a honey business, which is very crucial to our rural environment. And so in looking at that site, it would be whether, if they, under the existing provisions, almost any extension on that site would require a resource consent. So what we're saying is, well, we think that that's been a long existing activity there, and for also Rakai huts it has been as well. So perhaps there should be a little bit more alleviation of what people can do there that wouldn't see the need for a resource consent to build an extension.
Sure, I understand that. So I'm just with a planning framework, it's one thing to say the Rakai huts is zone settlement zone.
Yeah.
And these rules, should the panel get to that, and should there be scope, these rules don't apply in a settlement zone because it's already highly modified. So I'm interested though in translating that to a small rural site and how we might define that in the planning framework, as opposed to a large rural site or another rural site that hasn't been developed, and how we might triangulate down in order to deliver that outcome for you.
Yeah, and thinking of the Wāhi Tapu sites, some of them are reasonably large. So I think perhaps where I could clarify is where I'm talking about the sites, I'm actually talking around the building and the curtilage area rather than the actual property size.
So, and I'm pleased you raised that. So the rules at the moment, I think, talk about new buildings, and I think there's a size limit.
For dwellings.
Dwellings, yes.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's I think one of the pieces of evidence I've seen today talks about changing the size limit from 10 square meters up to 100 square meters on new buildings.
Yes, yeah.
But an alternative approach might be any development within, I guess, not necessarily the curtilage, but the curtilage plus 10 meters around it. The whole area has been modified over time, and actually any development within that sort of area of previous development is okay, but the rest of the site, which might be undeveloped, might be covered by the rules. Is that an alternative approach?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So just got a few more questions. Looking at your paragraph, I'm just trying to find 4.21, and there's some suggested changes there. In particular, I'm interested in clause E. And I appreciate why this change is being suggested for the purposes of planting trees, ecological restoration, or riparian protection. And I certainly understand, as I said, that the rationale for that. But my question is, none of those terms I don't think are currently defined in the district plan.
No, quite possibly not. So that has come as preferred wording to what we originally provided in our provision. So that wording has come from Appendix 2 of the officer report, where they've suggested those raft of new earthworks provisions.
Because I was wondering whether you'd be happy just to accept conservation activity instead, for the purposes of conservation activity, which is the use of land for the management, maintenance, enhancement of ecological values for indigenous vegetation, fauna, and habitats, and includes weed and pest control, fencing, and restoration planting.
Yes,
which is a defined term. Yeah. Okay.
Essentially, our request associated with that is very much to do with the Tanaku project, which is quite important to developing around our area, and we're looking to extend that project through further funding over the next few years as well. So we would hate to see a lot of that funding end up having to go to resource consenting activities when that's the idea around that.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that, and I understand the rationale, and these are I guess things that are good and encouraged, and it's about removing impediments.
Yeah.
So in places in your report, and in particular you mentioned it in 4.24, but you talk about the overlap with Environment Canterbury rules and resource consent requirements. And I understand the issue of duplication, and I've seen it across a lot of plans. I guess my question to you is, do you accept that regional plans, just like district plans, can change over time, and that there's a risk if the Selwyn District Council and community rely on provisions in a regional plan which are then changed in the future?
It is a risk, and I had discussions with Sam Leonard, who is the policy planner at Environment Canterbury, around that, and our discussions, because we thought we needed to contact them and talk about these sort of issues, and that came up. And at the moment, there's probably possibly a 3 to 4, 5 year difference between the process of these two plans. But then there is the local government changes that are pending as well. So we had a good discussion around that, and the ability to try and get our district council and regional council provisions so aligned that we don't have these sorts of situations happening, and that we can clearly go to one document and say this regulates this, and these things are the other things that are regulated here. So it gets rid of that overlap.
Yeah, look, I understand the intent. I just, as I said, this thinking about the documents are produced by different organisations through submissions process, decision making, hearings like we are here, and although the argument is why cover it twice, it may well be that it doesn't get covered at all through changes of district plan over time.
Yeah, I guess in our experience and my experience over time, that plans don't necessarily become less stringent. They always seem to go the other way. So yeah, I take on board your thoughts and comments, but to date that hasn't been our experience. But we're definitely looking forward to some rationalisation between the two.
Sure. Okay. No, I think you understand that. So yeah, so 4.37, it is interesting to talk about forestry is unlikely to locate there in the Turing and a Tupener overlay. And I guess the obvious question for me is, if it's not likely to locate there, what's the problem with having a rule then about it? But well,
No, so our thoughts around that is that it's already regulated by other provisions. So it's already within the general rural zone provisions, and then you have the plantation forestry provisions, but then you also have the ONL and the coastal environment provisions, which are quite stringent on forestry in those areas. So
Sure.
what we were trying to do there was illustrate that, well, we were trying to provide you with some certainty, really, that what I was saying and my evidence was that this is proof of why I'm saying this. So you could see that generally these things happen in more extensive properties in different parts of Selwyn district.
yeah, and you provided us with a list of forestry, a list of consents. So yeah. So I mean, it was actually helpful for you to provide that information and to talk about what, I guess what you're telling us is what's the risk if you didn't have these provisions. Yeah, I understand that. So in 4.42, you talk about subdivision rule. And I guess, are you aware of the submission by Federated Farmers seeking to amend the rule? So they only apply when the actual site and area of significance to the Renanga is actually subdivided itself as opposed to the broader site. Are you aware of that submission? Do you have a view on that?
Sorry, I was unable to see because I couldn't find it on the council website actually.
Okay.
But yes, because we've brought this up previously with other provisions as well, is that we've got the overlay on, say, part of a property, but not the rest of it, provides a very tricky situation. So, sorry, without actually seeing the wording of what they've provided in their evidence, I couldn't make a full statement on that. But it does go some way to helping the scenario, but I guess what it comes back to is if the NTTO is not there, then that provision would become redundant.
Right. It wouldn't be there at all anyway.
No, but we do understand that is valid in relation to the other overlays.
And do you accept the officer's arguments? I think that if an area is subdivided, there is more likely to be further development then on the two halves, or however many new lots are created, and that has an impact on what you're trying to protect.
So our experience and from an agricultural perspective is that often what drives a subdivision in a rural area is farming succession planning. And quite often it doesn't result in a dwelling on a site. More often than not, it might end up in a property being partially sold to the neighbour who wants to farm it. And or alternatively, they're looking at boundary adjustments in that sort of scenario. Okay. Certainly around in this area that we're talking about, it may be different in other parts of the Selwyn district, but certainly around this area, that's more of the activity. There's not so much activity now in our view, without having seen applications before the Selwyn District Council, that there's too much subdividing of small properties anymore.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So, and I think this is my last question. So, there's some suggested changes in your clause 4.49 to the matters, assessment matters, basically. And I guess it's around softening the language around the sort of mandatory consultation, I think. Yeah. And my question is, it's the rules themselves, though, Rule 1 and Rule 2, that refer to limited notification. Did your group make a submission on those rules and the limited notification requirements in those rules, as opposed to the assessment matters?
Not from memory.
Yeah, I didn't see one.
No. But I guess I come back to the wider sweeping submission that we made. Yeah. So we're sort of comfortable with that situation around the notification, but it's more about, and I think a really good engagement policy with some really good set protocols will help guide what happens further in these assessment matters, so that there is some really clear guidance as to when Papatipu Runanga would need to be consulted and when a cultural impact assessment would need to be done, and how that filters through as a staged, if you like, situation of consultation throughout these assessment matters and how the rules are actually applied in practice.
Yeah, sure, I understand. It's uncertain at this point in time.
Mm.
Yep. Thank you for that. No further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got a number of questions and I want to make use of your time actually, because we've got you till, as I understand it, 10:30, is that right? 10:30, and at the risk of putting you under the spotlight, we do take your submission seriously, and you've made some very worthwhile contributions, I believe, and we want to give them justice, due thought. So please indulge me. I've got a number of questions, but we'll get through them the best we can. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. 4.3, first of all, this is the overlapping overlays, if you like. You make the point in 4.3, it contains many overlays that by their nature and matter trying to address overlap other overlays, either in full or partly. In the last sentence of 4.3, while the more stringent provisions applies, it is not useful to have contradictory provisions applying in the same location when a more rationalised approach could be taken. I just pondered on that. I'm just trying to understand that, because each overlay will have its own reason for being, won't it? And so there will be places where they overlap, but how could you rationalise it where you would actually remove some of the reason for that overlay just because it happens to cross over another overlay?
Yeah.
I'm looking at I'm thinking of diagrams with subsets and circles and things, and you may have already answered that question with Commissioner Couch-Lewis, but I didn't quite.
No, well, it is a very good question, because I know Jane and I, in talking together, have struggled a bit with this, because there's so many things happening in those particular areas. And I guess you would have seen it in the map we provided from the Christchurch District Plan, is that there's little subsets of things in there, so that I think possibly they have tried to rationalise things that way, so that there isn't the several overlays covering over one another. We had thoughts of, okay, so what if you had just one overlay that was called the Lake Protection Overlay, and it had the Ngāwai provisions with it. It contained things around outstanding landscape as well, and some of those coastal environment things. There's a lot of similarities within the assessment criteria within those that you might take into account, especially in relation to SESM considerations. And I guess that's where we again had difficulty in trying to come up with an alternative boundaries, because there were so many things happening there. I think it's achievable, but I think it requires the parties to come together to work through what is the resolution for that.
So other than the complexity of having different overlays intersecting, which each one might trigger a consent requirement, so the proposition could be that a consent will be required for something in those overlays. The fact that there might be 2 or 3 different types of considerations, does it really cause hardship in the sense that a consent is required anyway, and other than needing some expert advice like your own to be able to guide people through it, that it's not going to remove the requirement for a consent, is it? If you rationalise it, is that right?
No. So the issue is where for us the NTT overlay comes beyond those particular areas. So there's that area, and so our consideration on that is that, well, you've got the 3 activities, or if you add subdivision in there, you've got 4. We're saying, well, we think that with these other suggestions that we've made, what is within that extra area is either covered by the regional plan, the Heritage Act, NES provisions, and then the things that we think fall out can be covered through the other rules of the district plan.
Okay, thanks for that. I understand that. Thank you. Now, 4.11. I just got to understand my question. Right. So this is the building and structures rules. The limits in the plan are fairly small, aren't they, for buildings and additions and things? And you make the point that you need to have more flexibility. And I was just going to put to you, there will be some situations where is it not better to require a resource consent process so that particular circumstances can be considered rather than trying to come up with a blanket provision, say 100 square meters or something like that. If it's restricted, discretionary or controlled, would there be some instances where it's better to assess things by consent if it's a straightforward process? And I guess that comes back to your other submission about whether it would be a straightforward process.
Yes, no, I think that's where our experience has been, that if we're going to have a resource consent process and that there is requirement to have engagement or input by Runanga, that it's clear what that might be. And it might be that MKT or the Runanga decide, well, in these situations, we don't actually need to see these applications come to us. Strictly, it might be the insertion of an accidental discovery protocol. So, and for instance, in talking with ECAN on their earthworks consents now, regardless of where they are, they have the standard tangata whenua condition. So it doesn't require necessarily any great detail from.
What's your understanding of the MKT advice that we've got as to how that process would work in terms of what iwi or Runanga would see? Did you understand how that would work? Or
well, my understanding at present is that they would get an application come before them and then they would make recommendations on that. And you would have seen the example that I put in there that sometimes that never gets to see or communicated from an applicant, and so they end up with a very strict set of conditions that have come straight from a recommendation that end up as a consent notice on their property. And what we're saying is, well, surely there must be a better way of engaging and coming up with really practical and relative conditions and recommendations than what is currently the case with some applications. But in getting back to, say, sites that are not wāhi tapu or aren't taona sites, but are in those wider overlay areas that, if those provisions are already provided for in some other way, or they only attract accidental discovery protocol, which is already required under the Heritage Act anyway, then is it necessary to require resource consent in those situations? And we would say we don't think it is.
Thank you. Just working through my next one, 432. 432. This is earthworks. Sorry, I'm just trying to understand my question. I won't ask it. It's a lot to absorb, but there'll be a number of these matters that we're questioning you on that we would like advice from the officer on as part of the reply report, because obviously the officer's done a section 42A report based on the submissions that were lodged. You've since provided this evidence, which is quite detailed, and we would really appreciate a response. And my 432 and 433, the earthworks provisions, I would seek some advice on that from the officer. Okay, now the next one I had was 436. Yep. Okay. 436 is where you've highlighted some of the bullet points there that the CLWRP regional plan deals with bores, excavation, deposition from over aquifers, gravel from lakes and riverbeds, and plantation forestry. And you've basically said that plantation forestry and mineral extraction activities would normally trigger the need for a consent from ECAN. So basically that's all dealt with through ECAN. in my experience, those sort mineral extraction and plantation forestry are always in district plans as well, matters of consideration. And I'm just trying to think, do you think the regional considerations would be as wide as the district considerations for those two?
No, so what I'm trying to explain there, maybe I haven't made it clear enough, is that so without the NTT overlay, that the district plan would still capture those activities under the general rural zone provisions.
And
So that if they needed consent, they would still be required to have them. But the difference is the assessment.
so is there a consideration of Māori values and that as part of the rural assessment criteria? Is that something you've asked for?
I think and
in paragraph 438, the impact of mineral
Yeah.
extraction on cultural and heritage values. So I think that's your angle, isn't it? Is to add some assessment matters into the general rule provisions.
I think we have actually.
Okay.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah.
That's not for forestry, it's just for
Yes, because I think forestry's got a slightly different criteria.
Look, we'll leave it at that. Now, 441 is you're wishing to have controlled activity status. Now, I think this is for subdivision. Yeah, we talked
Yes.
about subdivision briefly.
Yeah.
Instead of restricted. And this is something I was going to ask the officer to address as to why it would be restricted, discretionary, and not controlled for subdivision. And I probably don't need to ask you that. You've asked for controlled, and did you want to add to what your reasons for that were?
I think we've asked for controlled in our supplementary evidence to relate to Ngāwai sites.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
445, you've given some instances of a recent case in Selwyn Council where a consent notice was placed on a Ngāwai site. And I think what you're saying there is that consent notice is pretty onerous. Is that right? And therefore you're seeking changes to the district plan. But would that not be just a practice matter? In your experience, it's a bad practice matter. But does one example sort of negate the need for a rule in that respect, do you think?
I think there's several things going on with this particular one, and I was very conscious that the applicant is still in negotiations, and hence why it hasn't been referenced, but I can assure you it's a genuine case. So there's several issues there. One is the overriding issue is that the Ngāwai areas do need to be ground truthed as to the extent, because this one covers a site that hasn't had water for possibly 100 years in it, but not helped by the consultant dealing with it that's talked about the flowing stream. So, it's an awkward situation and a very unfortunate one. But in looking back at aerial photos from the 1950s, it's quite clearly obvious that there hasn't been water there. And just as background to some of these that require ground truthing is that the flows of the Rakaia River have changed significantly over the Selwyn side of it. And they were underground feeding many of these waterways, along with some significant changes in border dike irrigation, which also brought the water table up below them in these areas. So that's sort of that background. But yes, two things: the existence of perhaps Ngāwai sites being recognised that no longer have flowing water through a long history, but also that a proper engagement policy with protocols in place would have seen, I would have thought, potentially only one of these things ending up on the land use consent as a condition of the land use consent for the dwelling, as opposed to a consent notice on a subdivision.
And just while I'm on that, the MKT advice that we've been given in terms of how it should operate, are you satisfied with how that would deal with a situation like this, or is it not specific as to that?
I think it goes some way. It would be really good, though, to have a lot of those protocols that other councils are working with that aren't actually in the district plan somehow formalised, and that we're aware and the applicants are aware of how those work. And doing our background homework with the regional council rules, we had a really good discussion with one of the senior consent processes there who explained to us how they deal with consents and engagement with runanga. And it was very open, it was considered, it involved their applicant, and they also shared a concern that consent notices were being used quite widely at the district level when they would have seen a lot of these sort of similar issues would have been worked through, and the application itself would have recognised what it needed to do in relation to the site, rather than have it as a condition that hadn't really been talked about until coming out as a draft consent notice.
Looking at the with field streams that that hasn't run for 100 years. One of the things with the the OTTO, the overlay, is that the recognition and your description of that waterway and what it once did. How do you, not wanting to preempt at all, but the importance of actually giving recognition to a waterway of its history. Do you see that as being important to enable the overlay, to have an overlay over there to ensure that that history is voiced, like in a forum right now? Do you have a view on that at all?
Yeah.
Or do you? Yeah.
So I think as a way of, or what I would hope may be mooted in the future, is that recognition of some of these sites are done in a way that falls outside a regulatory process, that it isn't necessarily contained within the district plan, but is, can be things that relate to signage or a special recognition of a site that doesn't necessarily need to be covered by an overlay or specific rules in a plan. There's so many positive ways we could recognise those sites and get people on board around the protection or, the history of them, without the need to have, is it listed as a site within a district plan. In particular, probably the distinction needs to be made between what is a Ngāwai site and what is the NTT overlay. So the Ngāwai within the district plan is more about the ability for mahinga kai gathering in those situations. So our group is really positive around that sort of thing, and we are helping and trying to work through with Te Taumutu Runanga in reinstigating water flow in the Waikiwai stream further up where it has been dry, and recognising, well, yes, there has been this very long stretch that has been dry for many, many decades, but we're now consulting with them and their project to try and reinstigate water back through a part of that passage, which obviously would be retained in the district plan for that section. But yeah, there's the issue around the stretch that no longer has water in it.
Sure, thank you. One further question. No, we can have a break. It's paragraph 460, and that's concerning the dual naming of waterways.
Oh, yes.
And you've highlighted that, and you've said you asked that the hearing panel accept the recommendation of the reporting officer applying dual naming to reo, Māori and English. I didn't see that in the report, but I might have missed it. Is that in the 42A report, that recommendation?
I thought I saw it.
Okay. All right. I might be wrong. Is that the case? It is in there. Okay, that's fine. If you can tell us where it is now, otherwise we'll come back to it. But yeah, okay. I just didn't know what provision I was looking for, what part of the report.
We were very excited to see that actually, because
we did not miss it. Then.
No, the thing for we see is really important is if we're trying to get farmers to buy in or be even more responsive to their environment, they do need to understand what these mean. And unfortunately, Te Reo in schools wasn't there when these people were going to school. So it's really that situation of just allowing people to realise what they mean. So I think the reporting officer had thought I'd meant just in relation to specific sites, but actually was meaning that, and that perhaps there could be English translation for the overlay titles as well.
All right, we'll just Sorry, I'll just quickly go to that. What we're talking about, 1216. So, and while we're talking about that, Mr. Friedel, what's your understanding of how far that submission went in terms of, is it just waterways or just sites, or how did you understand that submission? The name's listed in the schedule. That's pretty clear, isn't it? So you're 1261.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking at the relief saw and the table further above.
Okay.
So it's talking about the dual naming on the overlay title.
Right.
I think that was raised in the submitter's evidence in
So you
terms of
responded directly to that submission.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's fine. Okay. Now, the only other, thank you. We've got no further questions, and thank you for enduring that and helping us immensely. The only other thing I was going to ask you before Ms. West comes forward after the break, we've got this. You've mentioned this joint statement, and is that, if I understand it correctly, that's simply amalgamating the two sets of relief into a combined thing. That it's like a joint witness statement almost, isn't it? And can I be assured that that's within scope, that the things you've asked for there are within scope of your submission, because that was to remove the chapter basically, I think. And that may well be Ms. West's submission as well. But to give you a break, if you don't mind, we could ask Ms. West any detail that's in here. We could address any questions on detail, or would you rather handle those questions?
How do you feel, Dan?
We're open either way.
Okay. Yeah. So the decision is that I can cover that.
Okay. What we'll do then, I think we've had a very long session. We'll have a break for a cup of tea, and if we have any further questions on this, we'll ask you when we come back. It might be that we don't. But if we come back at the time we had set aside, so we'll have just over 20 minutes. That'll give us a chance to go through it and see if we have any questions. So come back at 1:45.
If it helps, basically they are word for word what is you've already seen in our statement, with the exception of the engagement policy.
Oh, okay.
So we've just added that.
Take us to that now, and then we would have probably dealt with this. So that it's word for word. So you were very aligned anyway, by the sound of it. Is that right? You were very aligned in terms of okay. Yeah. The engagement policy, which is.
Oh no, I think we've just mentioned. Oh, yes. So I've got D on. So on page 3 of
Page 3?
that.
No.
Of your submission or Ms. West?
So of our
The
joint
statement. Yep. The one that's not stapled.
Yeah. So sorry for proliferation.
So D is objectives and policies.
Yes. So it was relating to that. So we just wanted to state there what our thoughts were on that. So if you had the ability to read that and then wanted to ask any questions,
sure,
that's all good.
Okay, hold on.
in saying that, I'm happy to do that after Jane has done her bit.
Yeah, that, and just for the record, what you're asking for there is some further work really between the submitters and the officers to potentially flesh that out a little more to cover some more aspects than what's been suggested to us by the officers. So we'll consider that and certainly deal with that. And as I say, it's unlikely we'll have any further questions, but if we do, we'll put those to you straight after the break.
Okay.
So we'll take the normal break. We'll come back at the normal time to give us time to do that. So we'll come back at 11:15 and adjourn the hearing. For now, thank you.
Thank you.
that break. That was useful, and it's been a very good session so far. We've really enjoyed the examination of some of the key issues. Right, the last set, we've got Stephen, Jane West, Sue Dillon, Jill Thompson, Heather and Trevor Teague, is that right? And we understand that, Jane, you might be speaking for the people, is that correct? Or? No? Oh, you're speaking for yourself, okay. Who wants to go next then? Yep, okay, so Sue Dillon, okay, come forward. Yes, certainly. Thank you, Sue. Welcome. Thank you. Right, we're in your hands, Sue.
Okay. My name is Susan Dillon. I'm a semi-retired farmer on a property called Waikirikiri at 178 Selwyn Lake Road. My now deceased husband and I have lived on this property, loved it to bits, and brought up our 4 children there. This statement covers the matters raised in my submission and also draws on the hearing statement of Jane and Stephen West, DPR 0299 of 28th March 2022, as they relate to the topic of sites and areas of significance to Māori, SASM, and the need for site areas to be protected and provided for within the planning under the Resource Management Act, 1991 RMA. I acknowledge the requirements of the RMA and the obligations under Section 6E to recognise and provide for the relationship of Māori lands, sites, waihi tapu and waihi tauanga. My submission disagrees with the Ngātauranga Tupener overlay, the NTTO. In support of my submission, I adopt the following clauses from the submission put forward by Stephen Jane West. Clauses 6 to 10, 29 to 43, 44 to 65, and 66. Clause 6 to 10. On a matter of a framework for consultation, we all need to be on the same page and to be able to submit effectively through a shared plan for consultation. This can be effected through a plan so that people can submit. After all, we are a democracy. Consultation with Roanga needs to be discretionary where necessary rather than implied as a requirement. The Council needs to set up a framework for the consultation process to function effectively. There needs to be a proper planning process to be put in place so that people can submit effectively with respect to consultation of the SASM, to guide and form assessment from either an applicant's perspective when for a resource consent or the Council when processing an application. Clause 29 to 43. Our land is our asset. We do not want the value of our land to dwindle over time. GRUZ rule sub R2 provides for subdivision as a controlled activity. However, subdivision within the NTTO has restricted discretionary under rule sub 20, 4 to 6 and is subject to SASM MAT2. We need to protect the SASM from inappropriate development, but it is not reasonable to require consultation as a blanket requirement under SASM MAT2 and the NTTO. The need for consultation needs to be linked to the effects of an activity, but SASM MAT2 requires consultation with the Papatipu Ruanga regardless of the effects. Should the SASM MAT2 continue to be adopted, there will never be appreciation of a farmer's capital. If you buy a house, you anticipate that your asset will appreciate. Farmers are the same. I spoke to my friend yesterday who works for a council. She told me she had just dealt with 3 consents for farmers who wanted to dig holes. Dig holes is what farmers do. Naturally, those farmers will be paying the council in question for those consents. The growing dissent amongst the farming sector will become explosive. Clauses 44 to 65. I fear that there's a serious lack of information. Suddenly things happen and the rug is pulled from under our feet. Whoever would have thought that the day would ever have come when we have had to get a consent to farm our own land? That certainly came as a hurry to me, and it came as a great shock. Even greater will be the shock in the future when some poor unsuspecting farmer will get 2 Cs in a row and be told by some official that he cannot farm his land anymore. Farming is hard enough to make $1 as it ever was. I sold 2 wool clips last week from 55 sheep for $100, not even enough to cover the cost of a shearer. Fluctuations of prices are unpredictable, as are now prevalent changing weather patterns. The works have been closed due to COVID and costs keep on rising. All this is enough without the fear of the unknown. This winter, we run the risk of turning into one ginormous river if the rain is heavy. Maybe we may have a historical Māori site in the middle of our most productive paddock. Is the site going to be then ring-fenced? And are we then going to be told that we cannot farm the land within a certain distance of that site? Let us remember that we live in a democracy and as such are protected by common law and a fundamental Bill of Rights that have power to exercise at any time. Let us also remember that historically, it is the farming sector that has pulled New Zealand out of the Great Depression of the 1930s and the late 1980s. Were the dairy farmers not performing the way they are now, the country could well be in Sorry Street. Councils do not want to kill the geese that lay the golden eggs. Otherwise, in the future, farmers may struggle to pay their rates. There is a real fear of the unknown out there. Are the Ruanga suddenly going to forbid the opening of the lake or decide that the future of farming is in ducks? That suddenly we will be gripped by a fervour that the lake must be restored to its prehistoric original levels? That there is a future in New York, a future market in New York for eels? The vagaries of the market are hard enough. Let us stick to our knitting and do what we do best so that you can sit on council and care for us in the manner in which we care for our land, with kindness and consideration. Please relieve us from our fears, as at present we are uninformed. The council have a duty of care to rectify that. Delete the NGA to Runga Tupener overlay, the NTTO, and avoid the duplication of the proposed Selwyn district plan with the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan. Do not overlap, otherwise the catastrophic implication for farmers will be horrendous. Should Ngāi Tahu have ultimate mana over the land we have paid for, laboured on, cared for and loved all our working lives? We pay our rates and recognise that we are caretakers of the land and uphold that responsibility in every sense of the word. On behalf of existing landowners in the area, I feel that we exercise great care and love of our land, and for that right to be usurped will bypass democracy and will change 150 years of electoral law. Thank you for time.
Thank you. We might just have some questions of you. Thank you very much for that presentation. I was just going to, I didn't quite write down the note where your property is. I didn't write it down in time. Whereabouts is your place? Right. So do you know, are you in the overlay, the NT, is your property in the NTTO overlay? I see some nodding in the background. Is that right? So that's your principal concern is the effects of that overlay. Okay. All right. I'll just see if the panel have any questions, Deborah. You want?
No questions, but look, thank you for coming and talking to us today. I appreciated that. Thank you.
Right. Okay. And who would like to go next? Is it? Yeah, and we have, incidentally, we haven't got any questions for your joint statement either, so I should have mentioned that. So thank you very much. Yeah. All right, and Ms. West. Okay, thank you. Right, Neil, just before thank you very much, and you would have heard all the questioning and responses. So we're in your hands as to how you wish to present it. But however you feel it's most efficient, we'll take it from there. Thank you.
I haven't prepared a summary statement like Kerry did. She's very good. But I thought if I do just start going through my statement of evidence, I'll try to sort of abbreviate where I can and maybe answer some questions as we go, if that suits you. I will start at paragraph 4. Except I've got the wrong copy in front of me. I've got a copy of my little notes. That's not it, sorry.
While you're doing that, can I just ask, Ms. Dillon, are you still here? Yes, you are. You were reading from a statement. Was that your submission you were reading from, or that's your submission? Okay, so we've got that. Thank you. All right, I was going to ask you to provide the notes, but you've already done that.
Right, here we go. Now I'm organised. So I am presenting this just for myself as a layperson, myself and my family. We're at 50 Selwyn Lake Road, which happens to be just down the road from Sue. And although I have provided my submission and my evidence to some of the local other landowners, that's why there's some reference to some of the things that I've said. This is presented really just for myself and my family. So in the first instance, at paragraph 4, I just want to point out that in preparing this evidence, I recognise and acknowledge the importance of SASM and the need for sites and areas to be protected and provided for within the planning framework under the Act. Further, I understand and acknowledge the requirements of the RMA and the obligations under Section 6E to recognise and provide for the relationship of Māori with their culture and traditions, their ancestral lands, water sites, wai tapu and wai taonga. Our submission intends to provide a more practicable and manageable way to ensure the protection of SASM in the Selwyn district, particularly with regard to the NTTO, and to suggest that this can be achieved through better understanding of the requirements and agreed appropriate engagement where necessary, still providing for the obligations under 6E and the avoidance of duplication within the proposed Selwyn plan and across other plans, such as the Land and Water Regional Plan. So I talk about the shared framework, which is this engagement policy that we've touched on already. So the officer's report discusses the national planning standards requirements for SASM, including items that the national planning standards suggest may appear in a SASM chapter of a district plan. This includes the need for an explanation of how tangata whenua or mana whenua are engaged. And in my opinion, this is an area that's lacking within the proposed plan and results in much of the uncertainty that's highlighted through many of the submissions on SASM provisions. There doesn't appear to be any firm information around how the engagement process will work with respect to SASM to guide and inform assessment from either an applicant's perspective or the council's when processing an application. Excuse me, this could be quite painful. Oh dear.
Hard, we can
yeah, we can just. I'll just try to be brief.
Right. Okay,
yeah.
that's right.
So, MKT highlight a scenario where, with Selwyn Council sometimes insisting on neighbours' approval to be signed, even when they've advised that there are no matters of concern and no potential effects. And they've stated that unlike Christchurch and proposed Waimak plans, there's not the shared framework for Mahanui when processing consents. So in my opinion, it's crucial that this process, like a process diagram or an appendix to the SASM chapter, or perhaps a policy framework, be developed for inclusion within the plan, so that everybody, including council staff, know what's required with regard to iwi consultation. And I note that the officer's report recommends an engagement policy as well, which is good. It echoes the sentiments within the MKT report. So I would support that recommendation for an engagement policy to be included in the plan. And we'll just note that the officer's report thinks there might not be scope, but Ms Barnett's talked about potentially the SI submission and Sue Dillon's that there might be scope found within there to get some sort of engagement policy into the plan. I just think it's an absolute priority and it needs to be developed as soon as possible. And I think regardless of scope, it sort of has to happen as a separate piece of work outside this process if necessary. And I do think it needs to be a notified process with some more targeted consultation with MKT and affected landowners, because it will provide much needed certainty for affected parties. And until it's complete, I think that's what makes the SESM overlays and some of those consultations requirement at best difficult to administer. I think it just highlights some of the confusion and the uncertainty that has come through the submissions. If there was something in place that we could work towards and a process that we could follow when dealing with iwi consultation and how the council is going to deal with that would be really helpful. I talk about the pre-hearing opportunities. I don't think I actually need to read through that. I'm just making the point that we did try to have a pre-hearing meeting and it was a wee bit disappointing that we couldn't have had some sort of meeting with council, potentially with an MKT person present, that it would have been really helpful and maybe it would have cut down on some of the length of some of these statements of evidence. Now, as far as earthworks goes, I think this has probably been covered by Ms Barnett. The only, in general terms, I support what the reporting officer has suggested, that basically separates the NTTO area and has a longer list of general farming, day-to-day farming activities that can take place. I mean, overall, I still think that it's sort of another layer of rules that we potentially don't need, and it doesn't make it any less confusing. But on the face of it, it's a better solution than what was there before. I don't agree. Paragraph 18, I don't quite agree that the changes, though, give a clear understanding of identified values of our land and the impact of these, of the value of qualities of our land, because I don't think that there's enough information in the NTTO, which I get to really have a proper understanding, and I think that's the main concern. But indeed, that longer list is a better solution. I don't really want to dwell on mineral extraction either, except to say that we at no time did our submission ever suggest that mineral extraction should be a permitted activity at all. My submission was always that we think that you do need resource consent for those activities. I also agree that Section 6E of the RMA needs to be taken into account with regard to Māori and the culture and traditions with ancestral lands, water sites, wahi tapu and wahi taonga. So I believe that is being achieved through the Ngā Wai, the wahi tapu and the wahi taonga overlays for SASM and the proposed plan. But I think that the NTTO covers such a large area of land that does not also incorporate wahi tapu or wahi taonga sites, silent file areas, water or wetlands, which is primarily the northern and eastern extent of the NTTO. That's located outside of the outstanding natural landscapes, Te Waihora overlay. So I'm really talking about those tracts of farmland that extend out from the actual margins of Lake Ellesmere that aren't covered specifically by wetlands. They're not part of the wetted area as the lake comes and goes, because there's a lot of land in there that's covered by that NTTO that I don't think needs to be subject to that overlay and the additional rules and regulations that go with that.
So, yeah, if you don't mind, I might just ask you a couple of questions as we go. It'll help give your voice a break.
Yeah, that's good as well.
But just to understand that point, so this is in the joint statement number G in the joint statement, page 5. So if I understand your point correctly, what you're seeking there is to strike out the NTTO, but to leave the mineral extraction rule applying to the wahi tapu, wahi taonga, but you're looking to increase it to non-complying. Is that right? So
so essentially what the way the rule works at the moment, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think at the moment in wahi tapu and wahi taonga you would be non-complying anyway, and in the NTTO you're not non-complying, you must be discretionary, and you're restricted. The point I'm making is the only difference between the general rule zone, Rule 21, for mineral extraction is that when you exceed an area of 1,500 square metres, you trigger the need for a consent. Whereas under SSMR5, doesn't matter what you're doing.
So I was going to ask you if that would be beyond scope to make it non-compliant because it would affect other people more. But what you said is that it's non-compliant anyway.
It's non-compliant anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's one of those rules that starts as discretionary and then has a non-complying status if you're in these areas. Okay. So by taking the NTTO out of SSMR5, you're essentially just I guess it's just a consequential amendment that whole rule becomes a non-complying rule. Yeah.
It's quite useful just to look at the relief as we go through. We'll look at the relief for seeking. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. No, that's good as gold.
Thank you.
Now, again, on forestry, I really think that Ms. Barnett sort of covered that. The only point I'm making here really is that under the NES for plantation forestry, Regulation 6, I'm at para 27, sets out the rules and plans may be more stringent than the regulations of giving effect to a national policy statement for freshwater management or the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. If the rule recognises and provides for protection of outstanding natural features and landscapes or significant natural areas, or if the rule is regarding unique and sensitive environments. So I accept that forestry activities have the potential to generate significant effects, and therefore Rule SSMR6 provides for plantation forestry in the Wahitapu, Waitonga and NTTO areas as restricted discretionary. And I'd also accept that in the Wahitapu and Waitonga overlay areas, they could be considered as sensitive environments in accordance with Regulation 6. But with regard to the NTTO, for the reasons I've discussed, I don't consider that Rule SSMR6 meets those criteria for being more stringent than the NES. So subdivision in SSM Matter 2, again, it's been covered, but I might just start reading and see where we get to on this one. So General Rule Zone Rule Sub 2 provides for subdivision as a controlled activity, whereas in the NTTO, we're restricted discretionary under Rule Sub 24 to 6, and it's subject to SSM Matter 2. Our submission is that although we acknowledge the need to protect SSM from inappropriate development, it's not reasonable to require consultation as a blanket requirement under SSM Mat 2 for an area as large and non-specific as the NTTO. The need for consultation should be linked to the effects of the activity, and whereas SSM Mat 2 requires consultation with Runanga as a given, regardless of the scale of effects from the proposed activity. Our submission does not seek to exclude Runanga or Heritage New Zealand from the process of assessing potential effects on SSM in the instance of a proposed subdivision, but to ensure that where consultation is required, it can be targeted and meaningful. And just as a note, I'm pretty sure that accidental discovery protocols are a standard condition on every subdivision consent issued by Selwyn Council. So having considered the submissions in the officer's report, would submit that sub R24.6 should be deleted and would support an alternative relief as requested by SI around the addition of an assessment matter under the subdivision matters for control or discretion that addresses the need to assess any impact the proposed subdivision may have on cultural or heritage values. So we're basically saying that why not put that in the general rule, because actually that may be useful to find any sites or areas of significance regardless of where the subdivision is. Just put it into the general rules rather than having to have sub 20 Rule 4 to 6 separately. And the issue again is the extent of the NTTO area outside the margins of Te Waihora, and that much of the NTTO land is not within or near any Wahitapu, Waitonga, Ngāwai overlay or wetland area. And this, along with the requirement under SSM Matter 2 to consult with Runanga regardless of the scale of the proposal, makes for an unreasonable amount of uncertainty for landowners within the NTTO. So our submission included requested changes to SSM Matter 2 as they relate to consultation regarding activities within the NTTO. I'm not sure, I didn't see whether the Section 42A report considered that submission, but I'm not sure if it would have been much different to the response and recommendation that was put forward. The issue here is that given the large area of land covered by the NTTO, which extends several kilometres from the margins of Te Waihora, and considering the distance from identified Wahitapu and Waitonga sites around the western shores of Te Waihora, having a blanket requirement to consult is rather a crude stick. So I had put together under SSM Mat 2 that it leaves no discretion for the council to decide not to require, and that should say consultation actually rather than notification. It would be required as a matter of course. So I've set out what SSM Matter 2 says, which I'll take as read. And Ms. Barnett talked about, we've got varying ideas about how we might prefer Saturn Matter 2 to actually be worded. In my submission, I really just, if you go to paragraph 38, I really just added the words if necessary to make the point that there should be a little bit more discretion about when and if that consultation is required. But I actually think that some combination of, and I'll get to it, but what's in the proposed WIMAC plan and some of the consideration that Ms. Barnett's put together, we've come up with a few options that we think might work a bit better.
Just to be clear, the MAT 2, you've suggested 2 criteria for that. You're seeking to get rid of the other ones, the 5 to 7 or whatever it might be. You think those 2 would stand by themselves?
Yeah,
right?
well,
Yeah.
Yes, the thing is that subdivision rule 24 to 6 refers specifically, is about the NTTO. So it refers specifically to Saturn Matter 2, which is about the NTTO. Yeah. So it's sort of, it's kind of one of those balancing act where we might ultimately say, perhaps there's no need for the NTTO, in which case consequential amendments would get rid of that anyway, the Saturn Matter 2. I guess what we're saying is, if we can find some reasonable alternative somewhere in the middle, here's a few options.
With number 3, which you're probably about to come to, you're suggesting the same thing with MAT 3. You're just replacing about 7 of them with 2 or 8 of them.
Yes, well, Matter 3 is with regard to Ngāwai, which I have to admit to not spending so much time on. So I'd probably refer to Ms. Barnett to explain the rationale behind the changes to Matter 3.
Because I can understand your logic for 2,
Yep.
because you're seeking for the overlay to be removed completely. So that, but for the 3, I'm not clear.
On the Ngāwai specifically.
Yeah, why you would replace it with just 2. But if Ms. Barnett wants to address us on that, you can, maybe after this one, or you can do it now if you wish.
So our intention here was to replace these 2, but retain the rest.
I'll retain the rest.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So you're just deleting 1 and 2 and replacing it with those 1 and 2. Okay, understood. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Where am I? Well, I'll just start at 37. The uncertainty surrounding these provisions is due to the reference to Ngāi Tahu essentially as a third party to a resource consent by the outcomes of engagement and consultation with Runanga being an absolute requirement. So this effectively preempts the consultation and notification process prior to any assessment of effects or knowledge of what activity is proposed and whether the potential adverse effects are such that Ngāi Tahu are considered as an affected party. So at para 39, I talk about how I've also talked about alternatives to those Saturn Matter 2, which draw on the proposed WIMAC plan. MKT acknowledged that many applicants find the process of engagement with Runanga unknown and challenging, and that an agreed trigger list is helpful to assist the council where applications are likely to be of a greater interest or concern to kaitiaki. So the list of triggers, which we have discussed already today, described by NKT, I think is a sensible starting point. But I do think that if such a list sits outside the district plan, affected landers just don't have the opportunity to comment. And in my opinion, it undermines the consent process and the process of notifying planning documents in the good faith that we all enter into when we apply for resource consents. So I accept that there's definitely a need for better iwi participation in resource management issues. And I believe there is a blurred line between consultation and decision-making responsibilities being shared between council and iwi. If there's to be a process of dual decision-making, both parties have to be equipped with the requisite qualifications to do so. But more importantly, there needs to be clear guidelines and understanding between the parties as to how that process will work that can then be communicated to applicants. And this reiterates the need which MKT described as their shared framework, whereby a set of parameters agreed upon to facilitate the process of consultation with Runanga. And I support the approach and believe it should be a priority to draft, notify and insert into the plan. And whether that's a policy or a guideline or an appendix to the SASM chapter, or I don't think it matters as long as it's in there and it's really obvious for people to draw on. So the Naturanga Tupener area, it describes, it's on the planning maps, it covers the land surrounding Te Wahora Lake Ellesmere. I'll take that as read, the description of what the NTTO is, but it includes any type of significant cultural site, whether historical or contemporary, known or unknown, land or water based. Our submission is that the broad description creates uncertainty for landowners where their land is subject to the overlay. The district plan describes the NTTO in the Selwyn district relates to Te Wahora Lake Ellesmere, its margins and associated wetlands, which is essentially the area covered by the outstanding natural landscapes Te Wahora overlay in the proposed plan. It's also closely aligned to the coastal environment overlay. So I submit that if the NTTO is to be retained in some form, that it should be reduced to better reflect Te Wahora Lake Ellesmere, its margins and associated wetlands. By way of comparison, silent files are generally described as identifying the general nature and location of waihi tapu or other special sites without disclosing their precise location. In these cases, although a precise location may not be known, a landowner is aware of the general location where something of cultural significance exists, providing the ability to work alongside local iwi in a meaningful way, if and when development is proposed. The NTTO is described as representing areas where mana whenua have an elevated concern with regards to the integration and effects of a wide range of land use-based activities, and may require notification or engagement with mana whenua as part of the planning process. And this is entirely reasonable if it is known what feature, place or site is required to be protected, because this would determine what the significance is or what the activities of concern might be. The broad nature of the NTTO does not provide a level of knowledge that would enable a landowner to work alongside mana whenua in a meaningful way. The uncertainty surrounding these provisions is further demonstrated by SASSA Matter 2, which we talked about obviously, where the matters for control or discretion reference Ngāi Tahu as a third party to resource consent by the absolute requirement for engagement with and outcomes from consultation with Runanga. As discussed above, this effectively preempts the consultation and notification process. I've already discussed the wording of SASSA Matter 2 and have suggested amendments. Along with the need for a guideline or shared framework to be developed to ensure that the need for and process of consultation is better understood, and that mana whenua don't end up inundated with resource consent applications. So the Christchurch plan and the proposed Waimak plan.
I have to ask you one question before we move on.
Yep.
And by the way, if any of the other panel members have questions as we go, please let me know, because it's most efficient to do this. But in terms of the assessment matters, and you've made the point. Let's have a look here. Paragraph 48. The uncertainty surrounding these provisions is further demonstrated where the matters for control discretion reference Ngāi Tahu as a third party to a consent by an absolute requirement for engagement. But the assessment matters that you're suggesting in this joint statement require the extent to which protection of sites, etc., to Papatipu Runanga is provided for in the recommendations of any cultural impact assessment. So doesn't that require that to happen as well?
Which one are you looking at? SASSA Mat 2 options or Mat 3?
Mat 1.
So where they've been consulted, first of all, gives the ability for the call to be made by council, I suppose, that there isn't a need to consult.
Of any
consultation. So, and I know it's a subtle difference, but the main problem that I guess I have with the way that the Matter 2 reads at the moment. So the way it reads at the moment says, the potential adverse effects of the proposed activity on Ngāi Tahu values as identified by engagement with the relevant Papatipu Runanga and the appropriateness of any mitigation measures. So it implies from the outset that you will have spoken to Runanga. Now, there are definitely cases where that's going to be required. What I'm saying is not in every case, and not with an overlay that is so the extent of which is so large as the NTTO.
But if we I understand that, but if we just look at Mat 1 in your page 6 there, the second point, I think, the second item covers the point you've just made. So where they have been consulted, so that leaves it open for council officers to say they don't need to be consulted. So but the first point, the extent to which protection of sites is provided for. So how would a planner be able to assess that if they don't consult with Papatipu Runanga?
Well, I guess that's the point, is if we don't know what sites and areas we're dealing with in the NTTO, because it's such a wide area, it's very difficult. I don't think they can. And I mean, that's kind of my point, is it's not just about, as a landowner, I don't know what I'm dealing with. Neither does a council officer. We have to have the discretion to make a decision on, I guess, a case-by-case basis as applications are made. And there might be plenty of times where MKT would say, look, we've got no issue with that. But there must be times where council knows that. prior to needing that.
So matter one would leave it open to a council processing officer to
Oh.
decide whether they need to do that or not. Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
which I'm not saying will be easy,
No.
but I guess is why we're saying that when you've got such a broad area like the NTTO, that's what makes it so difficult when you're dealing with the actual margins of the lake and the effects on wetland and wetted areas and all those sorts of things, and by all means the tributaries that feed the lake and all these things that we've been working on for a number of years. That makes sense. But when you've got, a piece of rural land that's been farmed for 100 years, that nothing different's happened on in that time, and suddenly whatever it might be needs, as a given, it needs consultation with Runanga. I just feel that opens up to, in the first instance, many applications and pieces of paper being sent to Runanga that they probably don't need to deal with. But it just puts a layer that I don't think is necessary on a lot of the land.
Just a final question on that before we move on. Have you got experience with other councils and how they operate their protocols with iwi and getting comments and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I understand from ECAN, and I think Ms. Barnett actually spoke to them quite recently just to reinforce this, but I'm pretty sure that they talk to MKT at the very beginning when they first get an application. I'm working on some managed aquifer recharge work down in Hines, and we are dealing with Arawhenua, and they want to know everything before we even make application, and that's fine. And that's part of that process. And I think Ms. Barnett touched on it as well, that what's really important is that we all know when we need to make contact and do it as early as possible and make it part of the process rather than a process of, I've made an application, now someone's making me do this now, and now I have to go and do that, and now this poor person in MKT has to respond, and it's just, that's not ideal.
So just to explore that further, because it's really important to us. I think what you're saying is that you don't, what you're suggesting is you don't put the protocol into the plan, but you leave it open as to whether the applicant has to consult or not. You leave it to the council officer who might engage separately with the protocol with iwi, but you don't want it enshrined in the plan to require it in every instance.
I want it enshrined in the plan.
What do you want enshrined?
I want the process and the policy of how the consultation process is going to work. I think that has to be in the plan. But what I don't think is that it needs to be a condition of every trigger for consent. So what you'd have in the plan is, should your application require consultation with MKT or iwi authority or whatever, here is the process that will be followed.
The instance of Arawhenua and Hines, I think you said that. What's written in the plan that deals? What's written in the plan?
So at this point, what we're dealing with is we're not dealing with anything that's written. It just happens to be a process that has been ongoing for many years. They've been part of the process for a long time. If we weren't doing it this way, we'd be putting the application into ECAN, and the first thing ECAN would be doing would be instigating this consultation anyway. So we're really preempting it, but because of the relationship that's already sort of enshrined through this project, they're saying we want to chat about it straight away, and that's what we're doing, and that's fine. But the problem is that your average landowner who's just applying for a consent to do something, unless it's in the plan and really obvious what's required of them, if it's just a piece of sort of a framework, a policy that sits outside the district plan itself, your average person's got no ability to really understand and work with that. And I've got no issue with, I'm sure the council already has some sort of framework with MKT and things anyway that they work to. I'm sure they do. But I think that if we're imposing the sort of requirements that SASM Matter 2 and others require, there has to be something that someone can see that lets them understand what that actually means.
So just, I'm sorry to harp on about this,
but
I'm just looking at what the officers have suggested to us in their notification clause, and it's number 9, clause 9. Any application arising from, and this is rule 2.7, shall not be subject to public notification where advice from the Runanga is received in respect to an application following engagement undertaken by either the applicant or the council. That advice shall form where the notification is to be served. So that
still implies that you've consulted in the first place.
well, it could be the way it's written. It could also be the council officer does that, not the applicant. So.
Yeah, that's fine.
It doesn't appear to be directive, but I might be
No,
wrong. Yeah.
True. And you're looking at rule 2, aren't you? You're looking at the subdivision rule 2. Yeah. I think it's the same wording, isn't it? Same
Yeah.
wording?
So
Yeah.
I mean, the way that's written, until we've heard from the officer, appears to leave a discretion for council officer to not require the applicant to consult with Runanga, but they may do it themselves. And I think that's how councils that I've experienced actually operate. They have their own sort of arrangements with iwi and so forth.
So that I don't have a problem with. But as soon as there's a rule that refers to SASA matter 2, so as soon as you do something that triggers a rule that says SASA matter 2 is a matter for discretion or control or whatever, then you get thrown into these two matters for discretion, which imply consultation regardless.
So what I just read out was a notification rule.
It's
and what you're
notification
saying,
rule,
if it
general.
triggers a rule, then you have to assess MAT 2 as it's written. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Now,
so
so,
that's
I'm
where we're
sorry
trying-
I've laboured
all right.
that one, but does the panel want to have any follow-up questions while we're on that?
So
Just a point of clarification really for me that because you've made a couple of comments, which is in terms of the knowledge, that you don't have the knowledge of the overlay, of what the overlay covers.
Yes, that's fair.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So my question then is, what knowledge is missing? What are you missing? What is it that you're looking for? And then I heard a little bit further on that you said that what you need is to be able to have assurance in terms of contact with Papatipu.
Yeah, so that's in terms of the engagement policy.
That the knowledge.
I think that would help with the knowledge, yes. But no, the knowledge is more about the size of the NTTO. So when you look at what the NTTO covers, and I touched on it not long ago, talks about Te Wahura, Lake Ellesmere, its margins and associated wetlands. So what our submission was is that what's actually covered by the NTTO is a lot more than that. And that's really the point that I'm making. So if it's going to cover this larger area, and if we're going to be subject to consultation as a requirement rather than a discretion, even in this much larger area that is larger than just the margins and associated wetlands of Te Wahura, how does a landowner deal with that? Because there's a real lack of understanding in terms of what that area is trying to cover. Now, I understand the description of what the NTTO is all about, but it doesn't give any certainty to landowners in that area outside of those obvious margins and wetted areas. I totally get that, and we've been working with that stuff for years. But there's just that, it's the uncertainty. And then when you layer that uncertainty, when you layer on top of that the necessity to consult when you don't actually know what it is you're consulting about, and this was raised earlier with regard to, I think, Fed Farmers saying, well, you know, where it is and where it isn't, a subdivision is or isn't inside a layer. I'm just suggesting that, first of all, the NTTO, I think, possibly doesn't need to be so big or doesn't need to be there at all. Perhaps it's covered by other layers. But without an engagement policy, without more knowledge of what we're protecting and what might trigger the need for consultation, everyone's a little bit in the dark. At the moment, you have to consult regardless, which I just, in my submission, isn't reasonable.
Hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
That within that overlay might be, this does not identify Wahi Tapu, Wahi Tonga.
Yep.
but there is actually a description of that it was a known area of occupation. Yep, areas where Tupener had been for various reasons.
Mhm.
Yep, so with the tapu off, it's open. Yeah. Knowing that and that history that might be there, that knowledge that's given, what would you do with that knowledge? If you got that knowledge as a farmer,
Yep.
as an applicant, what would you do with that knowledge?
Well, if that knowledge, if
That's
that,
what you're looking for.
that's exactly what people want, because there's, and I touch on this later with regard to, you know, a bit more consultation on just the layer itself, because I truly believe that if there was a little bit more targeted consultation when prior to this being notified, you'd have a lot less submitters and things saying, "Oh, we don't know what this is about," because if there was something identified, I don't know anybody, any farmer that wouldn't want to protect that. And if there was something identified, you would then have the ability and the like the sort of belief that you have to talk to NKT, that you have to consult, that you need to get alongside the right people to make sure you're doing the right thing. And I don't know anyone who wouldn't do that. If you had that knowledge, you'd do all the right things you needed to protect it, and it would be meaningful. And I think that's the problem I see, is that because it's so broad and because there's no real information. Now, I know that we can't pinpoint sites. No one's really asking for that, but there's the western sort of extent of the lake and around Fisherman's Point and around, you know, there's Waitapu areas, there's Waitonga areas, and some of that's known, some of that isn't, but in general, that's significant. I'm not arguing with that for a second. What I'm saying is that these large tracts of farmland come out to the other side. I should go that way for you, the other side of the lake. They're just, there's the margins, there's the wetted areas, there's the wetlands, there's the tributaries, there's all those things that we need to look after and are doing so through other regulation, other plans, that sort of thing. But when you get up into the farmland, you know, kilometres inland, there's no information, I guess, is the thing. And there's no knowledge, as you say, that would give the farmer or anybody the ability to then work with the right people to do the right thing. So at the moment, we're just a little bit in the dark. We've got this large area that that makes us subject to a whole bunch more rules. And I guess there's also a little bit of frustration with regard to land and water plan, farm environment plans, and all these things we've already talked about. And this is another layer that people are subject to without really any knowledge of what they're meant to do about it, essentially.
And I don't mind a yes or a no to this question. But with an understanding of the community and having the discussion of the overlay,
Mm-hmm.
the consideration of Ngāi Tahu values would be based around an outstanding natural landscape area, as opposed to saying the outer margins and wetland areas. But when it comes to actually broadening and looking at that history overlay further afield and out, that Ngāi Tahu values don't belong within that, they should stay within the outstanding natural landscape.
No, I don't agree with that. I agree. I think that Ngāi Tahu values are, I mean, frankly, they're everywhere. I get to it at the very end of my.
What do you do when it is?
What I'm saying is, I truly believe that the whole district, in fact, the whole country, is subject to. Of course it is. But no, you know, their ancestral lands. Of course they are. That's the point. Is that if you accept that it's everywhere, and I would argue that Section 6E of the Act requires that recognition regardless of an overlay. I don't, you know, put a line on a plan doesn't make any difference to me, really.
Fine.
But what we're doing is we're saying, if you accept that it's everywhere, then why do you need the NTTO? Particularly when there's only about 3 or 4 rules that are actually specific to the NTTO that make any difference to anybody. And under Section 6E, there's a requirement to do the consultation where necessary and all that sort of thing anyway. And that reinforces the need for the engagement policy, because if you've got all the right information in the plan as to how people go about working with runanga and protecting the areas when they, where need be, that's way more meaningful than blanket requirements to consult because you want to do a boundary adjustment and you're in this large overlay. If something like that was happening in Darfield, which isn't subject to the NTTO, but actually there was something significant, then there's already requirements and regulations in place for the council to do all the right consultation or require the consultation to be done by an applicant regardless. They don't have to
Thank
be
you for your
NTTO.
comments around that.
We'll just thank you for that. It's a useful discussion, but we must let you finish your statement. So you're on paragraph 50, I think.
I'm on paragraph 50. Okay. So this is where I talk about the Christchurch plan and the Waimate plan and trying to be consistent, which I agree with, but I just sort of investigated the NTTO extents and details in those plans, and I disagree that it's necessarily consistent. So under the Christchurch plan, Appendix 9563 provides the schedule of Ngā Tūranga Tupener areas. Tables 1, 2 and 3 contain identified sites with NTT classification. Table 1 contains natural features such as cave rock and shag rock in Sumner. Table 2 contains motu such as Quail Island and Littleton Harbour. Table 3 primarily contains New Zealand Archaeological Association sites such as Pa and Waikakariki. So for each NTT area identified in that appendix of the Christchurch plan, the site or area has a number, and that's also shown on the planning maps. It makes a site really easy to identify and provides useful parameters around where a site is and why it's significant. The sites are more specific than the blanket overlay used in the proposed Selwyn plan, giving a plan user or property owner a better understanding of what is identified so they can engage meaningfully. The extent of the natural and cultural heritage overlays in the Christchurch plan as it relates to Te Waihora is also significant. In the Christchurch plan, the margins and wetland areas around Te Waihora are classified as outstanding natural features and outstanding natural landscapes. These overlays cover the margins, wetlands and wet areas similar to the outstanding natural landscape Te Waihora or the coastal environment overlay in the proposed Selwyn plan. The Christchurch plan also contains Wahitapu and Waitonga areas identified along with silent files. There's no NTTO that extends around the margins and into the rural environment surrounding Te Waihora in the Christchurch plan. In fact, the rural environment inland of the immediate margins of Te Waihora is within the significant feature or significant landscape or rural amenity landscape, which is actually more aligned with the natural environment values and overlays within the proposed Selwyn plan. MKT discussed the obligations under Section 6C of the Act, and I've already stated that I acknowledge those obligations, but I suggest that if required at all, a more refined area such as the immediate margins, wetlands and wet areas surrounding Te Waihora is a better solution for the NTTO, which would also align more with the significance of the margins of Te Waihora within the Christchurch plan. MKT discussed Ngā Tūranga Tupener as landscapes within which Māori have traditionally settled and travelled, but this would surely encompass more land than just the area contained in the NTTO. The officer's report also discusses this and states in Selwyn context, all of the district is regarded as ancestral land by runanga and mana whenua traditionally occupied and used all the resources of the district. On this rationale, the entire district would be covered by an NTTO. Our submission is that the NTTO, to the extent that it affects large areas of privately owned rural land, is no more reasonable or the area more important than the rest of the Selwyn district. If all the district is regarded as ancestral land, but only some of it is covered by the NTTO, this reinforces the underlying concern around the lack of specificity as to requirements regarding the area contained within the NTTO and the certainty as to what will or will not be required in the future. And I think that's what we were just talking about. I acknowledge that the NTTO represents a broader range of culturally significant sites and that it's not realistic for it to pinpoint sites. However, as it stands, it leaves us with a situation where applicants have little idea of what a resource consent process or the cost and time involved might look like. And again, it brings us back to the need for that guideline or agreed framework of how consultation with mana whenua will work, and for this to be notified and inserted into the plan.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you again. I'm sorry about this. Just so I understand that you said it doesn't pinpoint sites, and you're correct.
Yep.
But in the Christchurch example, I thought I heard you say that it does pinpoint sites.
It's a lot more specific. No, it doesn't. I don't think it ever says here, but it draws a smaller circle around the areas where they expect something to be, I suppose. Yes, and it tends to be areas where there's also underlying wahitapu or waitonga as well. So there's there's areas where they know that there's things they want to protect, and it's probably been there, you know, been overlays for a while, and then they've drawn a slightly larger overlay to.
Since you're raising, just to follow up though, so I did have a look at the Christchurch District Plan. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. I noticed that the large areas of the Akara Harbour, and stretching 1 to 3 kilometres inland, and the ellipse right around the whole harbour, and also so Littleton and Akaroa and Lake Forsyth all have this generalised Tupener overlay. So it's not just specific sites; there are also quite generalised ones. So did you have a comment on that?
Not really. I guess I looked. I was really focusing on the lake zone itself, on Te Wahora. I don't know what the significance. I imagine there is quite a lot of significance with regard to the harbour and the peninsula and things. So that's probably why that would extend further inland. But no, I haven't given any.
So as a comparison, though, the Christchurch District Plan does have these quite large overlays as well.
Yeah, and look, so does the WIMAC. But I still think that there's a little bit more specificity within them.
Okay. And follow up, then you don't happen to know why Christchurch District Plan takes a different approach to Waihoa as opposed to the other areas?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No.
It's not
What I
obvious.
did, there was a bit of confusion, as I understand it, with the Christchurch Plan when it was notified, that I'm not sure that they actually remembered to put NTTO in it all. And I think that some of these overlays were a bit of almost an afterthought. And I'm not actually sure quite how much community input therefore was actually afforded to those overlays. So look, I don't know.
So it's a bit difficult for us to assess our alignment matter with Christchurch District Plan when they may have it actually wrong, rather than they have it right.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right.
And I mean, look, I support. I think there needs to be consistency. I think you're looking for that between your district plans, but there needs to be consistency for good reason.
I understand the argument. I don't disagree.
Yeah.
Thanks for answering these questions as we go. It's really useful.
No problem. Right. Yeah. Let's go to. I think I've already said that. Let's go to 58. A reduced NTTO does not reduce the council's ability to meet its obligations under Section 6E of the RMA, because there are still mechanisms available to include mana whenua in consent applications, regardless of the existence of a SASM overlay applying to the land or not. Of course, this process would also be included in an agreed framework for consultation. So regarding the proposed plan, first of all, I'll just point out that it's a proposed plan. So it was notified in December 21, and submissions are being summarised. They haven't opened the period for further submissions yet. So I don't think much weight can be given to those provisions, but I've still had a bit of a look at them. And it contains SASM Schedule 1, which numbers and lists SASM sites, and includes 10 NTTO with explanations provided as to the taonga identified within each, and it corresponds to each SASM on the maps. So although some of those are actually really general as well, I think there's one over pretty much all of Kaipoi, many are also quite specific. And the large NTTO areas contain many specific wahitapu or wahitaonga sites as well, which are also identified. So by contrast, the proposed Selwyn Plan NTTO doesn't provide specific locational or other information that would assist plan users. Instead, all of Te Wahora, its margins, associated wetlands and large tracts of adjoining farmland are identified. So I acknowledge that within the NTTO, there are some more specific wahitapu and wahitaonga sites, but those northern and eastern areas don't contain those. And the NTTO in the proposed plan just reflects what we already have regarding Te Wahora under the Cultural Landscape Values Management Area and the Land and Water Regional Plan. The proposed WIMAC plan has SASM R4 for earthworks within SASM, and it includes more permitted activities in all of the SASM overlays than the proposed Selwyn plan. But as we talked about earlier, I generally support what the office's report says to expand the list of permitted activities in the NTTO. The proposed WIMAC plan doesn't have any rules, SASM rules for mineral extraction or forestry, which was quite interesting. And the rural subdivision rule has a matter for discretion, and they call it MCD 7 mana whenua. And it's interesting because it doesn't require that consultation with iwi in the same way that the SASM matter 2 does that we were discussing earlier. And I've set out how their wording works with regard to if you're in the DTO and you're subdividing. And what I've then put together in my para 65 is some sort of trying to use that and put it into a Selwyn context that I thought was more appropriate than what SASM Matter 2 currently says in the proposed plan. But if you, the joint statement has essentially drawn on that and come up with a couple of options that we've already discussed that I think is probably what I'd refer you to with regard to SASM Matter 2. Land and Water Regional Plan. So during discussions on the statutory requirements, the officer's report deals with not wanting to overlap and avoiding duplication between council's roles. And the MKT report provides useful explanation as to SASM. And I acknowledge the purpose of the overlays as described, but our submission was that in terms of the NTTO, the purpose is already achieved by the cultural landscape values management area in the Land and Water Plan. So MKT discusses the NTTO as being primarily concerned with integrity of the environment, but does not represent a requirement equivalent to protection that would be associated with sites and areas which are wahi tapu. So although this appears to indicate less restrictions on the use of land within the NTTO, it does not alleviate the concerns around the potential for protection or restriction protocols and obligations of landowners to change over time, or that perception of loss of property rights. The NTTO covers the same area within the Selwyn district as the CLVM overlay in the Land and Water Plan. The CLVM area recognises the nature, concentration, networks and significance to Ngāi Tahu of sites and values within the area and provides for the relationship of Ngāi Tahu with Te Wahora. It is to be managed as one integrated freshwater mahingakai system with outstanding values to protect mahingakai, wahi tapu and wahi taonga, to restore the health of Te Wahora and to recognising the cultural and ecological sensitivity of the area to discharges of contaminants and the taking and use of fresh water. So within the CLVM, certain activities are subject to additional rule requirements or assessment matters due to their location in the zones. And I've listed there like wastewater, offal pits, stock holding areas, stock exclusion, stormwaters, etc. And as we've already discussed, the provisions in the Land and Water Plan regarding earthworks and the CLVM area cover the same requirements as those in the proposed plan, providing for the protection of riparian areas, erosion-prone areas and aquifers. And under these rules, all landowners with more, actually, this is the answer to that question we were talking about earlier, is landowners with more than 10 hectares. So if you're within the cultural landscape values management zone under the Land and Water Plan, you need a farm environment plan, you need a resource consent and a farm environment plan if you've got more than 10 hectares. So I guess to answer that question, there is the possibility of much smaller farms that might not be caught by the farm environment resource consent rule. I'd be quite interested to see how many farms in that area actually are less than 10 hectares. Can't imagine there'd be many of them. So farm environment plans are completed and resource consents are applied for, and they consider all those matters that are listed above. So it's our submission that it's unnecessary and unreasonable to impose another layer of restrictions and compliance matters that largely mirror what's already in place under the Land and Water Plan, along with the additional costs for landowners over the same area of land to achieve the same outcomes as that already imposed under the Land and Water Plan. And at the very least, I consider a reduced area of NTTO should be applied. So there's just a couple of other matters. When I looking at the Section 32A report, discussing the operative plan as it stands, it makes the point that the ODP adopts a fairly traditional approach in its recognition and protection of sites of significance, with what are described as poorly crafted provisions protecting and managing effects on cultural values with limited guidelines on what those cultural values are. So our submission is that in terms of the NTTO, this still holds true in the proposed plan with very limited guidance outside of the immediate margins of Te Wahora as to the cultural values that are within the NTTO. When discussing the Ngāwai overlay, the officer's report states that the identification of sites and areas of significance to Māori must be led by mana whenua. The identification process is not able to be determined by other parties. Now, although I agree that the identification of sites and areas must be led by mana whenua, consultation is a two-way street and private landowners also have skin in the game when an overlay is proposed to encompass land for which they are currently the caretakers. Now, I raise this only because there wasn't the meaningful direct engagement with landowners inside the NTTO area, and I think it would have been really beneficial if there was, if not to try to define the identification of SASM, but to be provided with more information around the significance of land to assist with ongoing recognition, understanding and protection as necessary. And I think that's what we were touching on a bit earlier as well. Excuse me. So the requested relief is essentially exactly what's in the joint statement, other than the SASM Matter 2. You've probably got a couple or three different options now that we're putting forward as to what might be best if we're going to retain SASM Matter 2. which is
That's only relating to the
only
NTTO.
NTTO. Yep.
All right, no, look, that's really useful. I'll just see if we have, I mean, we've covered things in
Yeah.
great depth, but I'll just see if we have any other questions before we let you go. I might start with Andrew this time. Andrew, have you got any questions?
Yes, I did have. I did struggle to ask you questions as you were doing it because you sometimes jumped sections where I had a question and I didn't want to bring
Sorry.
you back. So just to interrupt your flow. So I do have a few, but I'll just work with me while I try and find a question that hasn't already been covered. It's probably a very simple question. So paragraph 13, I just want to clarify the earthworks, why it makes it unworkable in a rural farming environment. Just so for a layperson,
Yeah.
e.g., what's ongoing farming activities that you just can't simply do?
Oh, well, that was with regard to things like, digging a post hole. It used to say, 200 mil depth,
Yep.
that sort of thing. So digging a post hole, burying a sheep,
Yep.
there's even some cultivation, if you want to do a deep rip to help with drainage or something like that, every now and then farmers might do that, and
Yep.
that might have triggered those rules. But I think that what the officers' reports recommended, that broader list,
Yes.
generally does deal with that. So the only point I'm making there really is that I still tend to think that in the NTTO, there's potentially not the need for that. I still think that the general earthworks rules would cover.
Yep.
And I think that if we could put in if we could add a assessment matter under the general earthworks rules, that it has to take account of Ngāi Tahu values anywhere in the district, that would better protect
Sure.
everything rather than having a separate set of rules for the NTTO. But it's better than it was.
No, thank you. But you also answered my follow-up question was around what the officers recommended
Yes.
changes and how, your comments on those. I had a point of clarification. So paragraph 14, earthworks rules within the GRUS chapter.
Yep.
And then you reference EWR3, which is an earthworks rule. So it's not within the GRUS chapter.
Yeah, sorry, that's my
I
mistake.
was just trying to follow through
Yes.
to clarify what you were
It's
actually
not
referring
under
to.
it's not under the general rules zone chapter. It's under the earthworks rules chapter.
Okay,
Yep.
and EWR3
And I've
is
done.
earthworks in the Grasmere zone, where it's within the tourist accommodation area.
Okay.
That was all. I'm not.
I've
It's not
referenced
trying
the
to
wrong
find a
rule.
problem.
My
I'm just trying to
apologies.
understand where
Is
you.
it R1? Is it R2? It
Where
might
you
be
direct,
R2.
yes, I think it's R2. So
That's-
that's where you're directing us.
Yes,
I think
I'm redirecting you to the general earthworks rule,
Thank
whichever
you.
that one
That's-
is.
Thank you.
That'll be a
That answers that
slip
question.
on the keyboard. But
No
since
problem.
you mentioned it at 17, I've done the same thing. I've said in the last line, I've referenced the general rules zone rules, and it should be the general earthworks rules.
Okay.
Yeah. So my apologies there.
No problems. So thank you. So the question around overlap with LWRP rules, and you talk about it in clause 15 and other places. And thank you for identifying that. It is of interest to us, the overlap and duplication, etc. It's just a question. So I was just looking at the LWRP rules, and the riparian areas are limited to, I think it's 10 metres and 5 metres of a waterway, so it's quite geographically limited. And I think the high erosion soil risk areas are mostly on the hills, not on the plains.
That's right.
And the aquifers have another set of requirements around depth.
Yep.
So actually, although there are rules in the regional plan dealing with earthworks matters, they're geographically limited and also limited in other ways. Plus, there's another set of permitted standards which may never apply. So how much duplication and overlap is there in practice?
So the main duplication that I've been discussing is with regard to the NTT overlay itself, and the fact that that mirrors the lake zone, the cultural values landscape management area under the
So it's
regional
more
plan.
that rather than those specific
It's
rules.
more that, but I did make the point about earthworks rules as well, because the excavation rules in the land and water plan are triggered as soon as you're excavating over aquifers. Now,
Yes.
that's most of the Canterbury Plains, and it's certainly all of the NTTO area is within the semi-confined or confined aquifer.
Yeah.
So those excavation rules, although there might not be duplication across the entire district, within the NTTO there certainly is. I think the point I'm trying to make is that we all need farm consents to farm. We all have to go through farm environment plan processes. and I don't know if you've ever opened the EGAN template for a farm environment plan, but there's lots,
Yes.
lots of it, and you deal with mahinga kai, you deal with nutrients, you deal with irrigation, you deal with your grazing, your cropping, everything. There's a lot of tabs, and you deal with all of those things. And I've just recently gone through this in the last couple of months and redone our farm environment plan, and it just brought home to me that we're dealing with the same thing over and over again. And I think that's the frustration that we're finding coming through this process, is that we deal with this under the land and water plan. We update our farm environment plans all the time. They're living documents. We get audited on them. And there's nothing in there that doesn't protect mahinga kai, ngā tahu values, and all those other things that we've talked about, that this stuff is also trying to protect. So I guess the point I'm making is that it's already there. We already do it. There's an understanding and an acknowledgement that it needs to be done. So when another layer is imposed that's very vague, and there's not quite the knowledge around how that's different, what do we have to do now that's different, and what does that mean?
So do you have examples of where you have a rule structure which says, except where all permitted already, the activity is already permitted by a regional council consent?
In the Selwyn plan?
No, that could be applied here to avoid that duplication.
Oh, I'd have to go and have a look.
Okay.
But yeah,
I think there was one discussion.
I guess I'm talking in general terms, because
I understand.
because when you think of the farm environment plan, of course, that sits outside of the rules in the plan. So the rules in the plan and the regional plan trigger the need for resource consent, and then with your resource consent, you have to prepare the farm environment plan, and then that's where you get into the real nitty gritty of what you're doing on your particular site and how it affects everything.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll just.
So it might not necessarily be a sort of a rule. This rule structure mirrors that one, and therefore we don't need this one. That's not really what I'm saying.
Sure. Just think we've covered most things. Just conscious of time.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry.
I just got a shock. The clock's saying it's 1 o'clock up here.
Yeah,
So, but it's not 1 o'clock. So we're okay for time. Yeah.
I think we'll cover. I think we've sort of covered some of those other questions. Thank you.
I asked Ms. Barnett, sorry, I'll jump ahead. I asked Ms. Barnett a question about duplication between the two authorities, and what I wanted to hear from you as well to get your answer to it was, even though the regional water plan and land and water plan and so forth require rules and assessments, are there any gaps in terms of the district council's functions that are not covered by their assessment matters, for instance, so that there is a need for another layer of control in terms of the district's functions?
I think that in terms of the area covered by the NTTO, and that's really what I've focused on, I don't think there's any gaps.
Okay.
And I recall the question you asked Ms. Barnett about, I think it was Mr. Willis who asked if there's a risk that if we don't put it in this plan and then it comes out of another plan, will it be forgotten about and not end up in any plans? And I realise how old I am, because I don't have any worries whatsoever that will ever happen. I've never seen a plan come out that's less restrictive. And my hope is that the councils will work more and more closely together to ensure that that won't happen. And I think that part of that is also working with, local iwi and making sure that we are all doing the right things in the right places. But the way it stands at the moment, there is a lot of repetition, and there's a lot of uncertainty around what's required now because of this additional overlay. But I don't have a concern about us losing, missing something or something falling through the gaps. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up, when I looked at that, your paragraph 71, where you talked about LWRP provisions and the CVLM, which covers the same requirements, providing protection for riparian areas, erosion-prone aquifers. And I just had the question, are new buildings, plantation, forestry, and mineral extraction covered by those ECAN rules?
Mineral extraction would, because you would be pretty sure you'd be digging down to within certain, groundwater.
Maybe.
Within groundwater
Maybe not.
potentially. I don't know of a quarry any time in the last 10 years that hasn't had consent from ECAN, put it that way. Forestry.
New buildings.
Forestry, maybe not so much, but the NES is in place anyway. New buildings, no. but that depends on, again, the excavation. So if you're building a new building in an area where your excavation means you have to dig to within a metre of the aquifer or what have you, then you may still trigger ECAN. The other thing is that as soon as you're discharging stormwater or, you know, construction phase stormwater, anything like that, you trigger ECAN plans.
But
So there's not a lot
there
of
may not be a
construction.
Ngāi Tahu cultural assessment, matter of
Um,
discretion for that though.
Possibly not, but I would argue that every council still has the requirement to take those values into account under section 60 anyway. I mean, if there's something that raises its head through the process of an application, whatever it might be and wherever it might be, that's still, any council still has the ability to engage with Runanga when it needs to. And I think that's really important that that's not forgotten, because I think that that's what we end up with sometimes is rule upon rule upon rule that specifically requires a certain thing, when actually there's a wider obligation for all of us to be aware of these things and to make sure that we're talking to the right people when any application is made, I suppose, or when any activity is carried out, even if a consent isn't required. That's where we're getting at with this knowledge of a process.
I've just got one with clarification, mineral extraction. Paragraph 78, you've actually mentioned general rural zone, rule 21. Was that one of, sorry, I missed that. Was that one of your corrections that it should have been earthworks or?
No, general rural zone rule 21 is the mineral extraction rule, I think.
Okay.
Someone with a laptop might be able to double check that. No, I think that is that's a specific mineral extraction rule.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we covered, and just like to thank you for thank you for enduring quite a long examination, and your voices seems to have held up, but it must be pretty tricky. Well done, well done. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Now we still have 2 submitters to go, and we've got Jill Thompson's the next person. Ms. Thompson, come forward when you're ready. You can take your mask off when you're speaking. You want to leave it on? Okay, that's fine. Yeah, by all means. Yeah. No, that's fine. Yep. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. You've been here for much of the hearing, have you? You've listened to since morning day. Okay, you will have heard a lot of the discussion. Anyway, we're in your hands to present your submission. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Sorry. Can I bring it? Sorry, I've got sore ribs. I can't. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. So first one is in Appendix 3 of the Section 42A report, Mahanui Kurataia's response. They mentioned the idea, they had a map overlay of extending Ngā Tūranga Tupener into the coastal marine area. That for the council would be literally ultra vires because the boundary of the council finishes at the beach, and so you have no rights to put rules in for the coastal marine area. Also under Section 30, functions of regional councils, in Section 31, the functions of territorial authorities. They have very different functions allocated to them. There is some overlap, but there are still different functions requiring different rules in each plan. And so the functions, powers and duties for the coastal marine area are largely allocated to regional councils. The other thing is the definition of hapua. I submitted that either the words which may be in the coastal marine area should be deleted or the definition should be revised. I take back, withdraw the definition should be revised and just strike out the words which may be in the coastal marine area. The reason for this is there's no definition, and also there's no definition of coastal lake. I like the definition of hapua as is, if coastal lake is left defined as not in the coastal marine area. My reason for my concern is Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere has a water conservation order on it. Water conservation orders can only be on water bodies, which by definition are only fresh water, not in the coastal marine area. So I would be concerned that hapua the definition of hapua, if it says it may be in the coastal marine area and somehow Lake Ellesmere is classified as being a coastal lake in the coastal marine area under this definition, it would challenge its water conservation order status.
Can I just ask, are your concerns there related to the NKT report or to the plan as notified?
The plan is
To the plan as
notified.
notified, okay, sorry.
So I'd like, while there's regulation making powers for coastal lakes in the Resource Management Act, they've never been used and there is no definition of coastal lakes. So just to protect the water conservation order, if those words could be deleted so there's no confusion, that would be really good. The water conservation order is needed. The lake is not in good condition and any protections that exist are important. So sites and areas of significance to Māori, I support all the rules except the Rule 2 earthworks and its proposed replacement of Rule 2.6. The reason I opposed in part the Rule 2 earthworks was that it didn't cover the burial of dead animals, which is an urgent action that needs to be taken, especially if the vets put them down and they've got phenobarbital in their system. There are regulations about disposal of stock or any animal with phenobarbital because it gets into the food chain otherwise. So it needs to be at a depth where it can't enter the food chain. So I'm really pleased with the proposed suggestion to change it and allow for emergency or for burial of dead animals without consultation. The other thing was I was worried about where there's piles of earth or a hole's being filled. And so the material there that's either been put in a hole or is in a pile of earthwork but has become part of the landscape. The concern there was that not with consultation with Ngāi Tahu or Historic Places Heritage New Zealand, that wasn't my issue. My issue was because I contacted the council to find out how much it would cost for the resource consent, which should be basically a rubber stamp if Ngāi Tahu's approved it, at $800 to $1,000 every time you realised you needed to dig a hole. So for rubber stamping something, having a council charge and a consent process seemed unrealistic. Perhaps it could have been treated as a deemed permitted activity if you had Ngāi Tahu or Heritage New Zealand sign off. So those were my concerns with the rules. It was one about cost and two about emergency.
Just trying to keep up with you, that last point you made, what rule was that you were talking about? Which provision were you concerned about?
I was concerned about the consent costs.
I know, but what was the rule that?
Oh, rule.
What was
it? For excavation earthworks, Rule 2, where it says the earthworks. There was no provision. Well, the provision was that if you were going deeper than 200 millimetres,
200, yeah.
You needed consent.
Deeper than 200. Okay.
But I have appreciated and have used the opportunity with excavating post holes because I realised that was exempt because it's not an earthwork. But it's made me mindful as I dig them, because I hand dig them, that to look for something. And so on that issue, we also are at 50 Selwyn Lake Road, but we own lots 2 and 3, so we own the driveway that Steve and Jane use. And we've got 1 kilometre of land where our boundary is the Selwyn River. My husband's family have owned that land and in the surrounding land up to the Lake Road for over 150 years. So there's a lot of history there. There were stories they've passed on as well. And I've mentioned this rule to them, to the older members in the family, and they said they fully support the rule. There is a lot of heritage under there, and with regret, they told me some stories of destroying some of it. So it is there. Also, my husband used to play, and his cousins used to play at a site, not on our property, where there were artefacts. So yeah, there are wahitanga in the area, and the family knows it. So there is heritage under the soil. It does need to be protected. So we support the Tupener, Tūranga Tupener overlay in the area. because there is heritage there. We know because it's been destroyed in the past. That doesn't mean that it's all been destroyed. There may still be surprises under the ground. So it needs to be protected. So my concern now is with what's proposed as the recommended rule, Rule 2.6. It feels as if Ngāi Tahu has walked away from trying to protect this land. The list of things you can do is excessive and unnecessary. A lot of the things that need to be done will already need resource consent, and so, or building consent. So what's the problem with also adding in a consent or a process to consult Ngāi Tahu on the way? So what I agree with the earthworks for planting trees, historic ecological restoration, riparian thing, because that wasn't covered before because they weren't a crop. They weren't pastoral crops, so it's good to see it. The installation of fences, yes, because normally our land is so soft in this area. Normally the fences are just, fence posts are just pounded in without excavation. Installation of septic tanks, I don't agree with that, or of farm tracks. I don't agree. I agree with some farm infrastructure up to a certain level. And I agree with installation of signs. I don't even agree with cultivation of with stop banks. Our stop bank burst on our property on the 1st of June, and ECAN is still fixing it. The land needed to dry up before they could access it. So from October to still now, they still haven't finished. They're still accessing it. So it implies that it's not urgent and there is time for consultation. If there's time for consultation, you should consult. You should not just go normal farming activities, because I think another submitter made the point about that it shouldn't prevent day-to-day activities, and putting in a fence post to where someone's damaged one or burying an animal, they are day-to-day activities. Building a farm track is not. Putting in a septic tank is not. You already need consent to put in the septic tank. You already need consent for the building site, either resource or building or both. You need consent for a well or a bore. There are no, so given that you can need consent for all these things, why can't you do this as part of the, if you're in the overlay area? It's not a big area. The overlay.
Which overlay?
The Turanga Tupener overlay.
You're saying it's not a big overlay?
No, it's not. When you compare the whole of Selwyn, it's not a big overlay, but there is a history there. Okay. And
it's just that other submitters have told us it's a large. I'm not saying it is big or small. I'm just, we've heard from others that it is a large area.
I know, but my husband's family history there shows that this has been a popular area in the past. I was disappointed to see, for instance, that installation of farm tracks. Our driveway, over which Jane and Steve have an easement, the previous owners before Jane and Steve decided to dig out it without our knowledge. They took the soil, which is quality soil, and put gravel from the river in it. That was 3,500 cubic meters of soil that was removed. So that's just too much. It was 7 meters by 1 kilometer. That's a lot of area to destroy without needing any sort of consultation or consent process. So I would say that, and also while the comparison, there was no explanation in the section 32 report as to why the depth was 20 centimeters, 200 millimeters. There was no explanation. Again, it's now changed from depth to volume of 300 cubic meters, but there's no explanation given as to why that's some. But that's equivalent to, if you're trying to imagine it, seven residential sized swimming pools. So if you were setting up a new premises, to say the land's been subdivided and you were setting up something new, the equivalent of 7 residential swimming pools should be enough for your barn foundations, your house foundations, a bit of a driveway, not a big one, but a bit of a driveway, your swimming pool, your offal pit, your barn, everything you would need. 350 cubic meters should be sufficient. In fact, you should be able to do it because the land, unlike Waimakariri and Christchurch, where I don't know if they've put limits on it, I didn't look, but their land is a lot harder than the land where this overlay is. This land is flat, it's soft, there are no hills to dig through. So perhaps, 100 and 150 should set any new house site and new lifestyle block up with everything they need with 100 to 150. And that's not a day-to-day activity. So I think a lot of these things should be struck out. I think it's excessive. I think farm tracks should be, there should be a limit on them because 3,500 cubic meters is a lot of history that could have been destroyed. And I don't know because I wasn't there. So this rule is just basically covered everything. There are no areas where in this overlay where there hasn't been cultivation. So protecting non-cultivated areas below to a depth below 20 centimetres, that's sort of redundant. There's nothing left. This area, as they say, is private farmland. It's been well developed. So I would like to see this rule rewritten. I would like to see a lot of the structures coming out. If you need a resource consent or a building consent for all of these things, then they shouldn't be in this list of permitted activities. I think the only things that should be there are simple things like an installation of a sign, which is equivalent to a fence post, putting in fence posts, cultivation down to a depth of 20 centimetres. I think ripping out a paddock, that should be consented, or you should at least consult. The idea of consulting, there's no thing. When we applied for our farm consent from Environment Canterbury, we had no idea who to consult for Ngāi Tahu. So we worked out, well, where's the closest marae? And we went out to Taumamutu, to Ngāti Moki. There was no one home, so we posted it. We didn't consult because we didn't have time. We had a day between the plan change coming in as to whether we needed to apply and 6 months on the other rules expiring. So we had no time, but we still posted it. Taumatu representatives came out as part of the site visit with ECAN. Was actually really, really helpful because ECAN were unrealistic about what could be done on the land. So it was really positive interaction. We actually learned a lot on the site visit. There is, so consultation can happen. I don't think it needs to be set out if you want to do it.
You do understand that these rules require resource consent, not just consultation. So to breach any of those things like the 200 millimetre depth, you'd have to apply for resource consent. And then consultation would be subject to, separate, the council would require it or it might not, or the rules here. There's a lot of discussion at this hearing about whether that's appropriate or not. But I think you've just mentioned consultation, but it would also require resource consent, and you'd be happy with that?
As long as when I actually had students do a project on digging a hole. So I think council's sick of what I want to do. But the concern is $800 to $1,000. What I would be prepared to consider, because that's just excessive for a hole, is it possible to get all farm consents? So put in the conditions of consent, accidental discovery. If the hole, you've got to clear it with Ngāi Tahu, but you don't need a further consent, things like that.
That's right. I remember you saying something about a deemed consent. We haven't got the answers. We're just considering all the evidence that's been presented. But what we have heard from other submitters is that it's quite onerous to apply for. It's not just $1,000. It's preparing an application, lodging it, having it, the time it takes to process, the uncertainties, all of that. We're hearing all of that as well. So it's not just a matter of chatting to the local iwi to see if they're okay with it. There's a lot more to it. So that you have considered that.
I have, because I apply for resource consents.
Yeah, you've done.
So what I'm saying is that for burying an animal, especially one full of drugs, I think it's unrealistic. For the rest, where you've already got to get a building or a resource consent for other reasons, such as a bore, then it shouldn't be onerous because it should just be part of the process. A lot of these things either need building consent or they need resource consent. So I don't see anything with extending it. And if it's not a day-to-day activity on the farm, if it's something extra, then
I understood your point on that. Thank you.
So but what I am saying is that I know from applying for a consent that I didn't get because I was doing the application, but I looked at a consent for an urban area to build a fence higher than the permitted boundary and permitted baseline, and I was told it was going to be $12,000 to go through the process for resource consent. Whereas if I got my neighbours to sign off as a deemed permitted boundary activity, it could be processed for $500. That still seems excessive, but what I'm saying is there some way Selwyn District Council, if you're doing the right thing, you're going through the process, can Selwyn District Council lower the cost? Because if Ngāi Tahu has agreed, if Heritage New Zealand has agreed, and then do they really need to spend time investigating it? Yeah. But if it's not urgent, then why not? The other thing I would like is there was a suggestion from Mahanui to put these rules up in the relevant places. So this rule 2.6 would sit with the excavation or earthworks rules. I think that's a good idea. And then in the sites and areas of significance to Māori chapter, reference where you can, the background to these rules and where you can find them. But I think putting them up so that they can't just be overlooked, I think is important. Yes, but the cross reference being in the sites chapter and then the rule sitting with earthworks. I think that's because at the moment the Land and Water Regional Plan is an absolute pain to use, where it's got chapters and you have to keep looking back and forth. If they'd set it out better to have the rules all in one place, I think that's important. And the accidental discovery protocol, I think that needs to be highlighted as well. I think if you can put it as a copy in the rules or as a footnote or something, that would be really useful. Because I think that's important to know, if you do find something, what do you do? But then if we need consents, as part of the consent conditions. But on my farm, I don't do a lot, but it's pasture. But we have had cropping, and even with the cropping, I can't see any day-to-day activities that would need it. The other thing I would like is a limit on the amount of soil that can be taken out for all activities. So the 350 cubic meters only applies to some of these suggestions. I think there should be an overall limit that within a 12 or a 24-month period, you have an absolute limit that you can't take if you're doing permitted, that some activities are still left like permitted, like erection of signs, if they don't need resource consent, or planting trees or something, some upper limit to just, because at the moment you could take out thousands of cubic meters. And there is heritage in there and it needs to be respected.
Well, to see if we have any further questions. Any further questions?
Thanks for your submission. With regards to your property itself and the location, would you say that it is site specific as an archaeological area as compared to the rest of the overlay, the NTT overlay areas?
I checked with Ngāi Tahu and we don't have any specific sites on our place. So I would say no, because my husband and his cousins' families, they owned the whole sort of area for a while. They had, so between them, it was sort of all connected families. We're the only ones with a piece of the land left. And so they roamed and they played, and there were things found all over the place. So it's not site specific to our particular property. No, it is the area.
So just taking it a step further, would you consider that the whole of the Selwyn district is actually site specific?
I don't know.
Okay.
I just know the family history of the land, and I've been told that. I'm not from Selwyn, so I'm not familiar enough with its history to know.
Thank you for your statement. You talk about an exemption for areas that had previously been disturbed, and I know that there is a rule a proposed rule in the proposed Waimakere district plan, which talks about permitted to disturb land if it's previously disturbed to the same depth. I guess that's the question I have around how would you administer that with any certainty that it is an area that was previously disturbed?
We have where the flood bank burst on our property. It didn't just take out the flood bank. It took out half a hectare of our soil down to an average depth of about 3 metres, but down as far as 5 metres.
Right.
So we've got a huge hole there that Ekin has filled with gravel, right out into my class 1 soil paddock that's normally cropping. We put a soil on top. So we've got to do, so anything that we would like to do there, it's visible on a map, on the Canterbury flood map of the history. So we've got proof that that happened. So submitting that along with or just being able to show that map to show where the hole was, and that it's now filled with gravel. So that was taken from upriver. There is nothing of historical value left. Whatever was there in the soil will have been washed out into the lake.
So
that
particular set of circumstances won't apply to every property.
No, but there must be, also like for our septic tank, which can be quite large hole.
Yes.
We've still got the pile of dirt there from the septic tank. We were going to get rid of it, but sheep like playing on it. So we've left that there, but we want to do something with it in future. I mean, it's grassed because it's been there so long, so it looks like part of the landscape. It looks like an oddity in the landscape because the landscape's flat. But at the moment, the way the rule's written, it's anything below the sort of level of, the ground level of the soil. So it still so that pile of dirt still gets caught.
Yep, I understand. No.
But again, it's probably got no historic value left because it was dug out and dumped.
I understand the simplicity of the approach. It's just how to craft a provision that actually is certain for the landowner, a future landowner as well, who's not aware of that sort of history, and council and the community.
And I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And just finally, you were reading from a statement today. Is that your own notes, or is that?
These are just notes. So if I had to quote anything, I had chapter and verse here.
Yeah, what we would like, because I must admit I had trouble keeping up with the exact things you wanted and didn't want. And if you have those written down in a note, that would help.
Leave them here.
Can we get some copies of that?
I'll just leave it.
Just leave it behind. Okay, thank you. Emma, you'll be able to copy that for us later on. Thank you. All right, thank you, Ms. Thompson. Really appreciate that presentation, and you did well with your mask on to talk through it. Very well done. Okay, right, we have one other submitter. Incidentally, we have another hearing starting at in about 15 minutes. So there's Ms. Heather and Trevor Teague. Is that pronouncing your name correctly, Mr. Teague? Is that right? Teague. Okay, I'll call you the right way, Mr. Teague. Thank you. Thanks for coming along and listening to all the discussion that's taken place. So again, if you have some notes, sir, that you've written up, we'll ask the person to take a copy of that too at the end. Got some scribble? Okay.
Is that better? Thank you. And sir, I'm not going to keep you for very long. There are no Māori sites on our place that are going to directly affect our property.
Where do you live, sir?
I was just going to tell you that. Our property is situated on the south bank of the Waimakere area. Otherwise, of course, we'd be in North Canterbury, wouldn't we? At Kauai Bush. There is no Queen's Chain. We bound the river. There's no Queen's Chain or Esplanade Reserve on our property. We have what they call a riparian boundary, which gives us the right of access to the centre of the river. It's an old English law that's never been tested in this country, I don't think, and we don't intend to. But our main concerns are being right on the bank of the river is that I believe that the Maoris may have some control over the riverbed. If they have control over the riverbed, our question is who is going to restore the bank when God takes some of it away? We've always been of the opinion that if God can take it away, Trevor Tay can put it back. we and it's got to be restored and protected. Now, ECAN's plan allows us to do that now, but if we do have any major works, then we have to notify ECAN so that if anybody reports us, they can say, okay, we know about that, it's permitted, and there's no probably. So the big question is, are we going to have these rights taken away from us? That's our major concern. We must protect our property.
I mean, we don't know the answers. We're here to hear what your concerns are, but what I'll just ask the officer to comment on.
You may not have the answers, but I hope you'll get them to me.
Well, the key thing is to find out your property where it's located. You've told us where it is, and south bank of the Waimakariri.
At Kai Bush, and it's RS 4074.
Yep.
You've got that number.
I'll just ask you: is that has that been addressed in the officer's report? That yeah. And can you just summarise or just remind us what you said in relation to that? That property would be affected by an overlay, where it is. We're not sure.
Just looking at this submission. Landscape. It's also got 5734, which schedule. That's probably the now why.
So you're basically just concerned, Mr. Tague, that any provisions don't impact on you as a farmer.
Yeah. I'm not interested in whatever else is going to happen to anybody else.
Understood. Yeah, and we've had a lot of representations from farming groups and others, agricultural people who have gone into great detail as to how the rules might affect farmers. So your concerns are in good hands, so we'll be considering all of that.
Yeah, and is there anything written down on what rights that they're going to have to the riverbed over and above what I or anybody else has got?
I can't answer that, but I don't think it's part of the provisions we're considering today, what happens with the riverbed by the councils, but that might be another matter.
Well, the council, of course, are trying to make the riverbed a significant area of natural landscapes. It's
another hearing.
Yeah, and I've got a submission for that too.
Okay. All right. We might see you again. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. No, look, thank you for that. We'll understand the concerns of farming community, and we'll take that on board. So. Yeah,
well, it's just the old Waimak can be pretty wild. It's a very swift fall at our place. And there's quite a movement of shingle, and we've got our own ditch digger, and we just stitch in time saves 9. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for coming along, Sir Tague. We might see you again. Thank you. All right, now right. Thank you everyone for coming along to the hearing. We'll have to adjourn it. We were going to have a separate meeting of the panel and pose some questions for the officer to help with the reply report. We will do that, but it won't be right now because we have to prepare in the next 10 minutes for another hearing. So we'll come back on that and provide some guidance later on. But as far as that goes, Craig, you will have heard a lot of discussion during the course of this hearing. I think you'll know the key things that interest us, but we will provide a list of maybe 6 or 7 items that we're particularly interested in. We'll pass that down the line. So thank you very much. Thank you for your report. All right, we'll adjourn the hearing on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you.